I'd always been a fan of the outdoors, so when my friend Alex invited me to join him for a weekend camping trip in the woods, I was all for it. It seemed like the perfect escape from the hustle and bustle of city life. The plan was simple: a 2-night stay in the deep woods, just the two of us, far away from civilization. We'd pitched our tent on the edge of a small lake, surrounded by dense trees. The weather was perfect, crisp and cool, with just enough sunlight to feel comfortable. The first night passed without incident. We spent the day hiking along the trails, fishing by the lake, and talking about everything and nothing. The kind of conversations that are only possible when you're away from everything, just soaking in the silence of nature. The air was clean. The sounds of birds and rustling leaves were soothing. It was the kind of tranquility that made you feel like you could forget about all your worries. As night fell, we built a fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories about old camping trips and childhood memories. The fire crackled in front of us, and the flickering shadows cast on the trees around our campsite made the night feel alive. The stars above were bright, and for a moment, it felt like nothing could go wrong. But something changed after we went to bed. I woke up in the middle of the night to an unsettling sound. It wasn't a natural sound, not like the usual noises you hear in the woods. It wasn't an animal, or the wind rustling the leaves, or the soft hoot of an owl. It was a low, rhythmic thumping sound. My heart skipped a beat as I lay still in my sleeping bag, listening. The sound came in intervals, almost like footsteps, but the rhythm was off, like someone was walking slowly, deliberately. I sat up in my tent, straining my ears. Alex was still asleep beside me, his steady breathing the only other noise in the tent. The thumping came again, louder this time, followed by a crack of a branch snapping. It was close, too close for comfort. I felt a cold sweat form on the back of my neck. I gently shook Alex awake, whispering his name. He mumbled something, still half asleep, but when I told him to listen, his expression changed. He grew still and listened to the sounds outside the tent. The thumping stopped for a moment, but then the snapping of branches came again, followed by a rustling, as though something large was moving through the woods. We both remained quiet, not daring to make a sound. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. It didn't make sense. Couldn't be an animal. We were deep in the woods, but we'd been in spots like this before, and I had never heard anything like it. I wanted to convince myself it was just the wind or some other natural explanation, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. We waited for what felt like an eternity, but the sounds didn't come again. Slowly, I relaxed, telling myself it was nothing, just my nerves getting the best of me. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep, though I didn't feel entirely at ease. The next morning, we woke to the bright light of dawn filtering through the trees. The events of the night before seemed distant now, almost like a bad dream. We joked about it over breakfast, trying to brush off the odd occurrence. Maybe it was a deer or some other animal. Alex seemed eager to forget about it, suggesting we go on another hike to explore a part of the forest we hadn't seen before. We spent the day hiking deeper into the woods, following a narrow trail that led us through thick brush and tall trees. It was beautiful, but there was something about the stillness of the place that felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was lurking just out of sight. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something behind us, but there was nothing, just the vast expanse of trees, stretching endlessly in every direction. When we returned to the campsite that evening, I noticed something strange. The campfire pit, which we had left undisturbed in the morning, had been altered. The logs we had carefully arranged were now scattered, as though someone had tampered with them. I asked Alex if he had moved them, but he shook his head. He didn't seem as concerned as I was, brushing it off as the wind or an animal. But I wasn't so sure. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The sounds from the night before echoed in my mind, and the unease that had settled in my stomach refused to go away. Every twig snap, every rustle of leaves, made me jump. My eyes kept darting to the entrance of the tent, expecting to see something, someone, standing there. Around midnight, the noises started again. The thumping, slow and deliberate, followed by the crack of branches snapping. This time it was closer, much closer. I could hear the movement of something large, brushing against the trees and the undergrowth. My pulse quickened, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. I could feel Alex's presence beside me, his body tense as he too listened to the sounds outside. We didn't speak. Neither of us dared to. The noises continued for what felt like hours, each passing moment more unnerving than the last. It was impossible to tell where the sound was coming from. All I knew was that it was all around us. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I had an overwhelming urge to run, to get out of there. But we were deep in the woods, miles from the nearest road. We were stuck. Finally, the sounds stopped.
No tumpín.
No cracking. Nothing. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, without warning, a single loud crash echoed through the forest, followed by a long, drawn-out screech. It sounded like an animal, but it wasn't anything I had ever heard before. The screech sent a chill down my spine, and I froze, my body rigid with fear. I glanced at Alex. His face was pale, his eyes wide. He didn't have to say anything. I could see the same terror mirrored in his expression. We didn't need words to understand what was happening. We were no longer alone. The rest of the night passed in a blur of anxiety and fear. We didn't sleep. We didn't move. We just lay there, listening, waiting for whatever was out there to make its next move. But it never came. The silence was deafening in its own way, and by the time the first light of dawn began to creep through the trees, I felt a strange sense of relief. Whatever it was had moved on. For now. In the morning, we packed up our things quickly, not even bothering to cook breakfast. We wanted to leave. We didn't want to stay in that place any longer than we had to. The forest that had seemed so welcoming just days before now felt suffocating, like a place that wanted to swallow us whole. We made our way back to the trailhead, our steps quick and erratic, as if we were being chased. Neither of us spoke much, the events of the past 2 nights hanging over us like a dark cloud. We didn't look back. We just wanted to get out. When we finally reached the parking lot, the feeling of relief was overwhelming. We tossed our gear into the trunk and got into the car without a word. As we drove away, the woods faded into the distance behind us, and I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the safety of the road and the noise of the world again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching, waiting. And no matter how far we drove, I knew that we had left something behind in those woods. Something that would never let us forget. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to take a solo camping trip into the Sierra Nevada mountains. I had been going through a rough few months, work stress, a breakup, general burnout, and I thought getting out into the woods alone would be the kind of reset I needed. I'd done plenty of hiking and some light camping before, but this was going to be the first time I was heading out completely alone, deeper into the forest than I'd ever been. I had a 4-day weekend coming up, so I planned to spend 3 nights out there, alone, with nothing but my gear, some books, and the sounds of the wild. I spent a couple of days preparing. I packed a lightweight tent, a good sleeping bag, a small stove, food for 4 days, water purification tablets, a hunting knife, and some basic medical supplies. I had a good backpack that fit everything tightly and evenly. My boots were already well broken in, and I had layers of clothing that I knew would be fine for the cool nights up there. I left my apartment in Sacramento early Friday morning and drove out toward the trailhead near Mono Hot Springs. It was quiet the entire ride, barely any traffic. I parked my car in a small dirt lot off the highway around 10 a.m. and double-checked everything one last time. I texted my brother my location and let him know I'd check in when I got back on Monday. Then I switched off my phone and buried it in the bottom of my bag. The hike in was harder than I expected. The trail was steep in places, and although I was in decent shape, the weight of the pack added to the strain. It took me close to 6 hours to reach the spot I had picked out on the map, a flat clearing near a small lake, surrounded by tall pine trees and some dense underbrush. There were no signs of other people anywhere. No boot prints, no campfire rings, no litter. Just nature. Felt right. I was tired, soaked in sweat, and hungry, but I felt good. alive, even. I set up my tent near the treeline where the ground was dry and covered in pine needles. After getting everything arranged inside, I boiled some water and ate one of the dehydrated meals I'd brought. Chicken and rice, I think. As the sun started to dip, I sat on a log by the lake and watched the water turn gold, then silver. I didn't hear anything but wind and the occasional bird call. No bugs, no people, nothing. That night, I crawled into my sleeping bag and fell asleep almost immediately. The next morning, I woke up sore but rested. My legs ached, but not in a bad way. I made some instant coffee, ate a protein bar, and walked around the area a bit. I found a little stream feeding into the lake, some animal tracks in the mud, probably deer or raccoons, and a bunch of fresh berries growing nearby. I spent most of that day fishing, reading, and just enjoying the peace. I didn't see or hear a single other person. Around midday, I thought I heard a plane overhead, but when I looked up, I couldn't see anything in the sky. That night, after another quiet dinner, I heard a sound that made me pause. It was just after dark, maybe 9 p.m. The moon was up and bright enough to cast shadows. I was sitting outside my tent, cleaning up from dinner, when I heard something from across the lake. It wasn't an animal sound. It sounded like a cough, a short, sharp cough, like someone clearing their throat. I froze. I listened. Nothing else came after that. No footsteps, no talking, no crackling brush. Just silence. I stood there for a long minute, listening. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe something sneezing or grunting in a way that sounded human. Still, I grabbed my flashlight and shined it across the lake. It didn't reach very far. The water just reflected the light back at me. I walked slowly to the edge of the trees and scanned around, but everything looked still. After 10 minutes, I gave up and went back into my tent. I kept the knife close that night. I didn't sleep well. The next day was quieter. I didn't hear anything strange in the morning. I made another coffee and sat for a long time by the lake. I kept turning the cough over in my head. It was just so specific. It hadn't sounded like a bird or a bear or any wild animal, but I couldn't prove otherwise. And even if it was a person, maybe it was just someone else camping nearby. Maybe they were trying to keep to themselves, too. That afternoon, I walked around the lake, mostly to see if I could find signs of another person. Footprints, gear, anything. The ground was soft in places, and I did find some tracks, but they weren't clear. They could have been mine from the day before. Still, I noticed something strange. About halfway around the lake, there was a set of flattened grass, like someone had laid there recently. No fire, no gear, just the grass pressed down in the shape of a body. It wasn't big, maybe someone thin, average height. It looked like they had just laid there for a while and then left. I got a weird feeling in my chest, like I was being watched. I scanned the trees around me, trying to listen for any sound. Twigs snapping, branches moving, breathing. But again, there was nothing, just quiet forest and the lake behind me. I turned around and headed back to my campsite quickly. I didn't run, but I didn't stop either. I felt stupid, like I was letting my imagination run wild, but something about that spot had felt wrong. That evening, I didn't cook dinner. I wasn't hungry anyway. I just sat by the lake until it got dark, then climbed into my tent. I zipped it up all the way, left my boots right outside like usual, and tried to sleep. I kept the knife next to me, handle poking out of the side pocket of my bag. I heard a few small animal sounds early on. Raccoons maybe, or birds, but nothing unusual. Eventually, I drifted off. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. I don't know what time it was exactly, but the moonlight coming through the thin tent fabric was weaker than before. What woke me wasn't a sound. It was the feeling of cold. My legs were freezing. I sat up, groggy, and reached for my sleeping bag zipper. That's when I noticed the front flap of my tent was unzipped. Just a few inches, but it had definitely been zipped all the way shut when I went to sleep. I sat perfectly still. I waited to hear something. I reached slowly for my knife and held it in my lap. I leaned forward and peeked through the small opening. Nothing, just the dark forest, my boots still where I left them. I stared for a long time. Then I zipped it back up, slowly, and lay back down without taking my eyes off the front. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just stared at that flap until the sky turned gray. The next morning, I packed up my gear. I didn't make breakfast. I didn't wash my face or even change clothes. I stuffed everything into my pack, rolled up the tent, and was on the trail by sunrise.
I gick fast.
My legs were sore again, but I didn't stop. Every time I heard a sound in the woods, I turned quickly, expecting to see someone or something behind me. But there was never anything there. Just birds, squirrels, leaves moving in the wind. After about 2 hours, I reached a fork in the trail that I didn't recognize. I pulled out my map and compass, double-checked my direction, and realized I'd taken a wrong turn. I must have been distracted. I was still heading west, which was good, but I'd veered off the main trail. I could either backtrack an hour to get back to the marked path or take a smaller, less maintained trail that looked like it would rejoin the main one after a couple of miles. I chose the shortcut. I just wanted to get out. That's when things got worse. The shortcut trail was overgrown in places. Branches scratched at my arms and legs, and the ground was uneven. I slipped a few times but didn't fall. After about half an hour, I noticed fresh marks in the dirt. Boot prints, not mine. They were deeper, like someone heavier had passed through recently. The pattern was different from my own boots. I kept moving, a little faster now, eyes scanning the brush around me constantly. Then I smelled something, faint but familiar, like smoke. Not wood smoke, but something sharper. Chemical, maybe. I slowed down, crouched a little, and crept forward. Around a bend, just past a cluster of rocks, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. There was a tarp set up between two trees. It was gray, sagging, dirty. Underneath it were some items, a plastic jug, a sleeping bag, some cans. It wasn't a campsite like mine. It looked lived in, like someone had been staying there for a while. I crouched behind a bush and watched. I couldn't see anyone, but I didn't want to take chances. I backed away slowly and kept moving. The trail grew harder to follow, and soon I was bushwhacking through thick brush. My arms were cut up, and my legs ached. I didn't know where the main trail was anymore. I just knew I needed to keep going west. I stopped twice to check the sun, trying to stay on track. After what felt like hours, I came to a small ravine. I had to slide down on my butt to reach the bottom, then climb up the other side. My hands got scraped on the rocks. When I finally found the main trail again, I almost cried. I recognized a fallen log I'd passed on the way in. I was maybe 2 hours from my car now. I picked up my pace, barely stopping to drink. The air was still as I trudged through the thick forest, my boots crunching against the layer of dead leaves underfoot. I had come to the woods to escape. The city, the noise, the constant rush of life. It had all become too much. I needed a break, and this trip to the woods was supposed to provide exactly that. A solo camping trip, something I had never done before. I wanted to challenge myself, to prove I could handle solitude in nature without any distractions. No phones, no social media, just me and the forest. The forest around me was dense, the trees towering high above, their branches woven together, blocking out most of the sunlight. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. The sound of my footsteps seemed louder now, bouncing off the trunks of the trees, and the air smelled damp, rich with the earthy scent of moss, pine needles, and wet wood. It was quiet, so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I had planned everything carefully. I'd done my research, made sure I had enough food, water, and gear for the next few days. I'd picked a spot on a map, a small clearing by a stream, where I could set up my tent and just relax. Nothing could go wrong. But as I neared the spot, something didn't feel right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the atmosphere around me had shifted. The woods were silent now, almost unnaturally so. No birds, no rustling of animals in the underbrush. Just silence. I shook the feeling off. Maybe I was just overthinking it. I had to keep moving. The stream was supposed to be close by, just a short distance ahead. I pushed through the thickening underbrush, wiping away branches and stepping carefully to avoid tripping. It felt like the forest was closing in on me, the trees growing closer together, their shadows stretching long and dark across the forest floor. After what felt like an eternity of walking, I finally reached the clearing. The stream was there, trickling gently over rocks, the sound soothing in the otherwise eerie silence. The area was small but beautiful. Green grass, wildflowers scattered around, and a few large rocks that seemed perfect for sitting or setting up a fire. I immediately began setting up camp. I wasn't exactly a seasoned camper, but I knew enough to get by. I put up the tent first, making sure it was secure and facing the stream. The evening sky was starting to turn orange, and I could hear the faint calls of distant birds, a sign that the forest wasn't entirely devoid of life. I started a small fire, carefully gathering kindling and making sure the flames didn't get too high. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the woods grew darker. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the air. The smell of burning would mix with the fresh, cool air of the night. I sat back, watching the flames dance, my mind beginning to settle. It should have been peaceful, but the silence was oppressive now, the air too still. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a sudden chill ran down my spine. I glanced around the clearing, but all I could see were shadows cast by the firelight. The trees stood like silent sentinels, unmoving, their branches heavy and dark. I shook my head. I was being ridiculous. It was just the isolation. I'd spent too many days in the city, surrounded by noise and people, that I was simply not used to this kind of quiet. As the fire burned lower, I crawled into the tent, zipping it up and settling inside. My sleeping bag was warm, and I felt my eyes growing heavy. The night stretched on in its stillness, and I eventually drifted off to sleep. I went camping alone in the summer of 2018. I was 34 years old and needed a break from everything: work, noise, people. I had just finished a hard year, and even though I wasn't the outdoorsy type, I thought some quiet in the woods would help. I chose a spot in northern Minnesota, close to the border. It wasn't one of the famous places people usually go. I picked it because it was remote, quiet, and out of the way. There was a small lake called Larch Pine Lake, and a few miles off one of the old service roads, there were some open campgrounds that didn't need a reservation. A friend had mentioned it once, saying it was nice but hard to get to. That sounded perfect to me. I packed everything I thought I'd need. I wasn't new to camping, but I wasn't a pro either. I brought a tent, sleeping bag, a small cooking stove, freeze-dried meals, water purifier, flashlight, batteries, first aid kit, and a few basic tools. I had a compass, map, and a GPS. I also brought a small hatchet, just in case I needed to cut firewood or clear branches. My phone didn't have reception up there, which I expected, but I brought it anyway just to use the camera. I also carried a notebook and pen. I liked writing random thoughts, especially when I was away from people. I parked my car near a small, unused ranger station that looked like it hadn't been open in years. It was about a 4-hour drive from my place. From there, I hiked almost 2 miles down a narrow trail. It was overgrown in places, and I had to push through a lot of branches. I didn't see anyone else, not a soul. That made me feel good at first. No kids screaming, no loud campers blasting music. No one. Just me and the woods. The spot I picked was maybe 50 yards from the edge of the lake. There was a small clearing where the grass was short and the ground was flat. You could still see signs someone had camped there in the past. Burnt logs around an old fire pit, a couple rusted beer cans half buried in the dirt, even a broken camp chair off to the side. It looked like nobody had been there in years. I pitched my tent, set up my little cooking area on some flat stones, and filtered some lake water to boil later. The trees surrounded me on all sides, but the lake opened up the view to the west, where the sun would go down. I couldn't have asked for a better place. The first day was quiet. I walked around the edge of the lake, explored a little through the trees. I found some old trails that were hard to follow but gave me something to do. I didn't bring music or books on purpose. I just wanted the quiet. I saw a deer at one point. It ran off as soon as it saw me. Later that evening, I made a small fire, cooked one of my meals, and sat by the lake until it got dark. It got cold fast after the sun went down, which I didn't expect for August. I put on a jacket and went inside the tent, falling asleep earlier than usual. That night was when things started to feel a little strange. I woke up around 2 in the morning. At first, I didn't know why. It wasn't a dream or anything. I just suddenly opened my eyes. I lay still and listened. The woods are never completely quiet. There are bugs, frogs, the occasional bird. But that night, everything sounded still. Completely still. That was the first thing that felt wrong. It was like someone had muted the whole forest. I lay there for a while, heart starting to beat faster. I didn't hear anything. No wind. No sounds of the lake. Nothing. Just stillness. I told myself maybe the wind had just stopped. Maybe the animals were just still. I didn't want to spook myself. I sat up, grabbed my flashlight, and turned it on. The beam lit up the inside of the tent. Then I unzipped the flap and poked the light outside. I didn't see anything. The trees stood still, not moving. I stepped out slowly, boots crunching on the dirt and pine needles. I shined the light around. Still nothing. I walked a slow circle around the tent. My breath was visible in the beam of the light. That's when I realized how cold it had gotten. It didn't feel like normal August cold. It felt like late October. My fingers started to sting. I pulled the jacket tighter around me, zipped up, and stepped back inside the tent. I stayed awake for another hour. Eventually, the normal sounds came back. First a cricket, then something small rustling in the brush. That made me feel better. I finally fell asleep again just before sunrise. The next morning, I didn't feel rested. I made coffee with lake water and sat by the shore, trying to shake the feeling from the night before. The sky was clear and blue, and the sun felt warm again. That helped. I decided to explore farther, see if there were any other clearings or trails. I took a day pack with food, water, my compass, and marked the tent on my GPS. I walked about a mile east, through thick trees and brush. After a while, I found a strange area. The trees here were spaced farther apart, but the ground was covered in broken branches, almost like something had stormed through. There were no tracks, no signs of machines or animals, just snapped limbs and deep marks in the dirt. I walked through it slowly, feeling uneasy. Some of the marks looked like they were made by dragging something. But again, no footprints, no tire marks. It didn't make sense. I didn't stay there long. I turned back and made my way to camp. That night, I didn't make a fire. I cooked with the stove and stayed inside the tent after dark. I kept the flashlight by my side and the hatchet within reach. I wasn't sure what was bothering me, but something just felt off. I woke up again, sometime in the night. This time I heard something, a crunching sound, like footsteps on dry needles. It was faint but steady. I held my breath and listened. It came from the woods behind the tent. I turned off my flashlight and stayed completely still. The footsteps were slow, not rushed. I heard them move around the edge of the clearing. They paused for a while, then continued toward the lake. I didn't dare unzip the tent. I just stayed frozen, listening. After a few minutes, they faded away. I didn't sleep after that. When morning came, I got out and checked around the camp. I didn't see any footprints, but the dirt here was mostly dry and covered in leaves and needles, so I wouldn't expect to. I walked toward the lake, checking the area. I saw something strange on the shore, a set of smooth drag marks in the sand, leading into the water. Not deep, but long, like something had been pulled. Again, no other signs, just those marks. I stared at them for a while, then walked back to camp. I told myself maybe it was an animal, a deer maybe, or a bear pulling something, but I didn't really believe that. I'd seen tracks before. These were too smooth, too straight, and too clean. It didn't look like an animal had done it. I ate a small meal and tried to calm myself down. I told myself maybe I was overthinking it. The fourth night was the worst. I didn't fall asleep. I just lay there in the tent, listening. I had the flashlight ready, the hatchet next to my sleeping bag. Around midnight, I heard the sound again. Footsteps, closer this time, slower. They came up near the tent and stopped. I could hear breathing, not an animal. It was too steady, too human. I held my breath, heart pounding in my ears. The breathing stayed for what felt like a full minute, then slowly moved away. I finally grabbed the flashlight and shined it outside. Nothing, just trees and darkness. I stepped out, slowly, turning in a circle. The air was cold again. My breath hung in front of me. I saw something near the fire pit, a small object sitting right in the middle. I walked over and picked it up. It was a piece of cloth, old, torn, dirty, like a piece of a shirt sleeve. I didn't bring it. I didn't leave it there. Someone had placed it there. I stood frozen, holding it, every hair on my body standing straight up. That was it. I made the decision right then to pack up at first light and leave. I didn't sleep. I just sat there, flashlight on, watching the woods. Morning came slow. When the sky started to lighten, I packed everything fast, not even eating breakfast. I stuffed the tent into my bag, didn't care how neatly. I just wanted to get out. As I started walking, I kept looking behind me. I didn't hear or see anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The trail back to the car felt longer. I kept thinking I'd hear footsteps behind me, but it was silent. I made it back to the ranger station around noon. My car was fine. I threw everything into the back and got in fast. Locked the doors. I didn't relax until I was on the highway again. When I got home, I looked up that area online. I found a few mentions of people going missing near the old trails around Larch Pine Lake. Not many, just rumors and a couple vague stories on forums. One person had written something about finding clothes in the woods. Another talked about someone walking around their camp at night. No names, no clear details, just stories like mine. I never went back. I never even went camping again. I kept the GPS, but I deleted the coordinates. Sometimes I still wake up at night, thinking I hear footsteps. I know what I heard. I know what I saw. I had been working nonstop for the past 11 months, barely taking a weekend off, and by the end of September, I felt like I was burning out. The kind of tired that doesn't go away with a night's sleep or even a week off. I needed real quiet, something away from cars, screens, and other people. I started looking at some hiking maps and decided I'd go camping up in northern Minnesota. I'd heard from a coworker about a place near the Canadian border where you could go days without seeing anyone if you timed it right. The idea of being out there alone, just the wind in the trees and the sound of water, sounded like exactly what I needed. I spent a week planning everything. I had a new tent I hadn't used yet, one of those solo backpacking ones that weighs almost nothing. I packed enough food for 5 days, mostly dehydrated meals and snacks that didn't need cooking. I brought a basic first aid kit, extra layers in case the temperature dropped, and my little backpacking stove just in case I wanted something warm. I even remembered to bring iodine tablets in case I needed to drink from the lake. I wasn't expecting anything to go wrong. I camped plenty of times before, and I wasn't going that far off trail. The plan was simple. I'd park at a small trailhead I found online, hike in about 8 miles to a backcountry site near a small, unnamed lake, and spend a few nights out there. No cell service, no people, just me and the woods. The drive up was uneventful, just long. Took about 5 hours. I remember passing fewer and fewer cars as I got closer. By the time I turned off the paved road onto the dirt one that led to the trailhead, I didn't see another vehicle for at least 45 minutes. It felt like I was already starting to get away from everything, and I liked that. I reached the trailhead mid-morning. There were no other cars there, which surprised me a bit, but I figured that was a good sign. I locked my car, adjusted my pack, and started hiking. The trail was well marked at first, cutting through tall pine forests with patches of bright red and yellow leaves where the trees had started to change. It felt like I was walking into some kind of painting. After the first couple miles, the trail narrowed and got more overgrown, but it was still easy to follow. I passed one trail marker nailed to a tree at around the 4-mile mark. After that, I didn't see any more signs or markers. The map I had showed the backcountry site was just past a narrow ridge overlooking a small lake shaped like a crooked finger. I kept hiking, checking the map every so often. The terrain started to rise, and I could tell I was getting close to the ridge. I reached the lake around 3 p.m. It was smaller than I expected, maybe the length of a football field and a half, with thick woods on all sides. There was no sign anyone else had been there recently.
No footprints, no campiriaches, no trash.
I found a flat spot about 30 yards from the water, just behind a thick clump of birch trees, and set up my tent. I laid out my sleeping bag, rolled out my pad, and set my pack inside the tent. The air was cool, with a steady breeze coming off the lake. It felt like the kind of silence you only get way out in the woods, where even the birds seem quieter. That first night was uneventful. I ate a cold dinner sitting on a log I dragged over near my tent, watched the sky go dark, and crawled into my sleeping bag as the stars started to come out. I slept surprisingly well, better than I thought I would being so far out. There were a few noises during the night. Cracking branches, some rustling, but nothing unusual. Probably just squirrels or a raccoon sniffing around. I woke up a few times to adjust or shift around, but otherwise it was peaceful. The next morning, I made some instant coffee and walked down to the lake. There was a low mist hanging over the water, and everything was still. I sat on a flat rock and just watched the water. Around mid-morning, I decided to explore a bit. I followed the shoreline for a while, stepping over logs and pushing through underbrush, and eventually circled back to camp by early afternoon. I didn't go far, maybe a mile or so in either direction. I didn't want to get too turned around. I didn't bring a GPS, just a compass and my printed map. I had a good sense of direction, though, and I wasn't worried. That night, I heard something different. Around midnight, I woke up to what sounded like footsteps. Not the quick, rustling kind of an animal darting around, but slow, steady steps. One at a time, spaced out. They were faint at first, and I thought maybe I was imagining them. But then I held my breath and listened. There it was again, a soft crunch. Then another. It sounded like someone walking on the edge of the campsite, just outside the birch trees. I stayed perfectly still in my sleeping bag, listening. The steps stopped after a while, and I didn't hear anything else. No heavy breathing, no twigs snapping, just the wind in the leaves. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe a big one, or maybe just branches falling. It had been windy. I eventually fell back asleep, but I didn't sleep as well as the first night. The next morning, I looked around the area near my tent. I didn't see any tracks or prints in the dirt. The ground was hard-packed, covered in pine needles and leaves, so I wasn't really expecting to find much. But still, I looked for any signs. Nothing seemed disturbed. My food bag, which I had hung up in a tree, was still there, untouched. My gear was all in place. I shook it off and tried to enjoy the day. I went for another walk in the afternoon, following a dry creek bed that led east into a denser patch of woods. It was cooler in there, darker, and the ground was softer. I found what looked like an old deer skull, bleached white and half buried in moss. I took a picture of it and kept walking. After maybe 30 minutes, I turned around and headed back. I started noticing small things on the way back that didn't sit right with me. A tree with fresh cuts in the bark, like someone had struck it with a knife or hatchet. A clump of leaves that looked like it had been moved recently, like someone had crouched there. I tried to tell myself I was overthinking it. This was public land, after all. Someone else could have been out here a few days ago. Maybe a hunter scouting the area. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside the tent felt louder. At one point, I heard what sounded like something dragging across the dirt. A slow, scraping sound like a stick being pulled or maybe something heavier. It lasted for a few minutes and then stopped. I held my breath and waited, but nothing else followed. No voices, no light, just darkness and the occasional gust of wind. The next morning, I decided I would cut the trip short. I didn't feel right staying there anymore. I didn't have a logical reason, nothing I could point to as proof that something was wrong, but I trusted my gut. I started packing up. As I rolled up my sleeping bag, I noticed something strange. A small rock, about the size of a baseball, sitting right next to the side of my tent. It hadn't been there the night before. I was sure of it. The rock was clean, not covered in dirt or leaves like everything else on the ground. I didn't touch it. I just stared at it for a while. Then I finished packing, tightened my boots, and started hiking out. About a mile into the hike, I realized something that stopped me cold. I wasn't seeing the same trail markers I had passed on the way in. The terrain felt familiar, but the details were off. A tree that should have been on the left was now on the right. A fork in the trail looked different than I remembered. I checked my map again and again, trying to make sense of it, but the more I looked, the more I felt like I was off course. I kept moving, trying to retrace my steps, but it didn't add up. After a few hours, I stopped to rest. I wasn't lost yet, but I felt like I was getting close. I sat on a fallen log, drank some water, and looked around. That's when I noticed something else. Another rock, like the one I saw near my tent, sitting just a few feet off the trail. Clean, round, out of place. I didn't know what it meant, if it meant anything at all, but it made my stomach drop. I stood up and kept moving. I didn't want to stop again. It took me the rest of the day to find my way back to the trailhead. By the time I reached the car, the sun was starting to set. My legs ached, and my shoulders were sore from the pack, but I didn't care. I got in, locked the doors, and started driving. I didn't look back. On the drive home, I kept thinking about the sounds I heard, the rocks, the strange feeling I couldn't shake. I never saw anyone, not once, but I know someone else was out there. Someone who didn't want to be seen. I told myself it could have been another hiker, someone passing through. But why were there no other cars at the trailhead? Why leave the rocks? Why follow me? I haven't gone camping alone since that trip. I still love the woods, but now I stick to campgrounds, places with other people nearby. I keep thinking about how small things can build up, how something can feel wrong even if you can't explain why. I don't know what would have happened if I stayed another night. I don't want to know. I got out before anything happened, and that's enough for me. Some part of me still wants answers, but a bigger part is just glad I made it out. I think sometimes the woods aren't dangerous because of animals or the weather. Sometimes it's the people you don't see. It was late September when I decided to take some time off and get away from everything. I had been working long hours at the warehouse for months straight without a real break, and my back was killing me. I didn't want to go somewhere crowded or touristy. I just wanted peace and quiet. So I started looking into some remote camping spots a few hours away from my place in Missoula. I found this area near the Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest that looked promising. Not a designated campsite, but a patch of public land where people could camp if they packed everything in and out. I checked the map and saw a dirt road leading in about 2 miles off the highway, then a small clearing by a stream. It looked perfect. I packed up my gear the night before. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, water purifier, bear spray, hatchet, extra food, and a backup GPS in case my phone lost signal. I even brought an old notebook and pen, hoping I'd feel inspired to sketch or write something. I wasn't planning to be gone long, just 3 nights. It was meant to be a short reset. I left early Friday morning and made it to the trailhead just after 10 a.m. The dirt road wasn't maintained well, but my truck handled it fine. When I reached the clearing, there were no other cars. No signs of recent activity either. Just me, the trees, the sound of the water nearby, and a few birds overhead. I parked, loaded my pack, and hiked in about half a mile before finding a flat spot near the stream. The ground was soft with moss, and there were no obvious signs of animals. I set up camp there. The first day went smoothly. I gathered some dry sticks and started a small fire, boiled water from the stream, cooked some instant noodles, and sat watching the sunlight drift between the trees. It got cold quickly once the sun dipped, but I had layered up. My sleeping bag was good for low temps. That night, I fell asleep to the sound of the stream. In the middle of the night, I woke up needing to pee. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The moon was out, making everything glow slightly blue. The trees looked almost silver in the light. I walked a few steps away from the tent, did my business, and looked around. I noticed a distant rustling sound, but figured it was just a deer or raccoon. I wasn't nervous. This was nature. Things moved in the woods. The second day, I took a hike up a small ridge to get a better view of the area. I brought my binoculars, hoping to spot some elk or other wildlife. I did see a couple of birds and what I think was a bobcat in the distance, but it was too far to tell. When I came back to camp later that afternoon, something felt off. I couldn't say what at first, but it was like the air had changed. I looked at the fire ring and saw that some of the kindling I had stacked looked moved, like it had been brushed or kicked. Maybe by wind or an animal, I told myself. I double-checked my food storage. Everything was still in the bear-proof canister. I hadn't left anything out, but that feeling didn't go away. It stuck with me through the evening as I made dinner and sat by the fire. I kept turning to look behind me, expecting to see something in the woods. Nothing ever showed up. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept hearing faint sounds, sticks cracking, leaves rustling. But every time I stuck my head out of the tent, there was nothing. The flashlight beam caught empty trees and brush, unmoving. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks, or maybe a fox nosing around. The third day, I woke up feeling tired and kind of irritated. I made coffee and sat by the stream trying to shake off the weird tension I felt. I debated packing up early, but I didn't want to let nerves ruin my trip. So I went for another short hike, just a loop around the area to clear my head. I brought my pack with some snacks and the GPS, just in case. I was gone maybe an hour and a half. When I got back, I noticed footprints. They were faint, but definitely not mine. They were boot prints, slightly smaller than mine, and they came from the direction of the woods behind my tent. They circled the tent once, then veered off toward the stream. I crouched down and looked closer. They were fresh. I knew how the dirt and moss held impressions here, and these weren't there earlier in the day. My stomach dropped a little. I scanned the woods, listening hard. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound except the stream and wind through the trees. I stood still for a long time, then slowly walked the direction the prints had gone. About 20 yards into the trees, I found a broken branch hanging down low, fresh snap, bark stripped. No other footprints after that, just forest. I went back to camp and sat down to think. I didn't want to panic. Could have been a hunter or someone just passing through. But I hadn't seen a single other car, person, or sign of human activity since I got there. And someone circling my tent without announcing themselves wasn't a good sign. I kept the bear spray on my hip after that and kept checking over my shoulder. I tried to act normal, made lunch, cleaned up the area, and even tried to read. But I couldn't focus. Every sound made me flinch. As the sun started to go down, I made a decision. I'd leave in the morning. One night early wasn't a big deal. I built up the fire bigger that night, thinking it might keep animals or whoever away. I sat close to it, wrapped in my coat, listening for anything out of place. It got colder that night than before. My breath fogged up in the firelight. Around midnight, I heard a very soft rustle again. This time it was definitely close. I froze and grabbed the flashlight. I stepped just outside the firelight and turned it on, sweeping it slowly through the trees. For a moment, nothing. Then I saw something move, just a flicker. I moved the light back, heart pounding. There was someone standing between the trees, not far, maybe 30 feet away. He was wearing dark clothes, standing completely still. I couldn't see his face, just the outline. I yelled out instinctively, but I didn't hear anything back. He didn't move. I held up the bear spray and shouted again. Still nothing. Then he slowly stepped backward, into the dark, until I couldn't see him anymore. I stood there for a long time, shaking, the flashlight trembling in my hand. Eventually, I backed toward the tent, never turning away from the woods. I didn't sleep at all. I sat inside the tent with the bear spray ready and a small knife in my hand. Every now and then, I thought I heard branches creak or leaves crunch, but I never saw him again. As soon as the sun started rising, I packed everything. I didn't even eat. I just tore down the tent, shoved everything in my pack, and headed toward the truck. I moved fast but kept looking behind me every few steps. My heart was hammering the whole way. When I got to the truck, everything looked untouched, but I didn't waste time. I started it up and drove straight out, tires slipping on the dirt a few times. I didn't stop until I got to the first gas station back near the highway. I went inside, got coffee, and sat in the truck for a while. I kept looking around the parking lot, like I expected to see him. I couldn't shake the image of him just standing there, not saying anything, not moving. I didn't report it. What would I even say? Some guy in the woods stood near my tent? But I never went camping alone again. About 2 weeks later, I read a small local news story online. A couple hikers had gone missing not far from where I'd camped. They'd found their truck parked off a trail, gear still inside. A search team went out, but the hikers were never found. The story barely got attention. No details, no theories, just gone. I didn't tell anyone what happened to me. I still don't know what that man wanted, why he didn't come closer, why he circled my tent, or why he just stood there watching. Maybe he was waiting for me to fall asleep. Maybe he was waiting for something else. I don't think about it much anymore. But I have a dog now, and I never go into the woods without someone else. Whatever he wanted, he didn't get it from me. But I think about those hikers sometimes. I think about what would have happened if I'd stayed one more night. It was late September when I decided to take a break and go camping alone. I'd been working nonstop for months, and my head felt foggy all the time. I needed to be somewhere quiet, somewhere with trees and dirt and not a single phone signal. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, just left a note on my kitchen counter in case something happened. I know that's not smart, but I didn't care at the time. I just needed to breathe. I picked a spot in northern Maine, about 5 hours from where I lived in Portland. The area was part of a large national forest, but it wasn't one of the popular camping areas. It didn't have campsites or signs or restrooms, just woods. I had come across it a couple years ago during a backpacking trip with friends and marked it on an old paper map I kept in my glove box. I remembered a small clearing not too far from a narrow stream, surrounded by thick trees. It was quiet and untouched. That's where I headed. The drive up was uneventful. Long stretches of road with nothing but trees on either side. I stopped once at a gas station to grab extra water and a sandwich. The last 30 minutes were on an unmarked dirt road that twisted through the forest, and I had to slow down to avoid the deeper ruts. When I finally parked, the sun was dipping low, and the trees cast long shadows. I slung my pack over my shoulders and started hiking. It took me about an hour to get to the clearing. The trail wasn't really a trail, just a faint path I remembered. I had to push through some brush, and at one point I thought I'd lost the way, but then I saw the slope that led down toward the stream. When I reached the clearing, everything looked just like I remembered. The ground was soft with pine needles. The stream gurgled quietly about 30 yards away. There were no signs of people, no footprints, no trash, just trees and the smell of dirt and sap. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, where the ground was flat. I unpacked slowly, took my time, made a small fire using some dry wood and my lighter. I cooked a quick meal with my camp stove, just a can of chili, and sat there eating, watching the sky turn darker. No noise but the wind in the leaves and the water flowing. The first night passed quietly. I slept hard, deeper than I had in months. I woke up just as the sky started to lighten, made coffee with my camp stove, and sat with it in my hands while the world woke up. I didn't plan to hike or go far. I just wanted to stay there, away from everything. I read for a while, walked around the woods, followed the stream for a bit, looking for animal tracks and anything interesting. I saw a few deer trails, a lot of squirrel chatter, and once I found a small patch of mushrooms growing under a fallen log. By late afternoon, I'd gathered more wood and piled it near my fire pit. I ate another meal, this time a freeze-dried pasta mix. I stayed up a little longer that night, watching the fire and listening to the dark. The stars were bright. I didn't feel scared, just calm. The kind of calm you forget exists when you're stuck in traffic or checking emails. But then the second night changed everything. I was almost asleep when I heard the first sound, something snapping. Not the gentle creak of trees in the wind, but a sudden, sharp crack, like a branch breaking under weight. My eyes opened, and I lay still, heart starting to beat harder. I figured it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear. I'd seen scat earlier in the day that looked like it could belong to a black bear. I stayed quiet, listening. There was another noise, softer this time, a rustling, Slow, steady. I reached for the small hatchet I kept next to my sleeping bag. I didn't unzip the tent. I just waited. Whatever it was, it didn't come closer. After a while, the noises stopped, and all I could hear was the stream again. I eventually drifted off. The next morning, I checked the area around my tent. Nothing unusual. No prints, no disturbed brush, no torn food bags. I convinced myself it was a raccoon or something small, maybe even a porcupine. I was on edge for the rest of the morning though, constantly glancing into the woods, ears tuned to every crack and chirp. By the afternoon, I started to relax again. I went down to the stream to wash my face and refill my water bottle. I always boiled it after collecting. I squatted near the edge, watching the ripples, and noticed something across the stream. At first, I thought it was just a weird-shaped stump, but when I looked closer, I saw that it was a sock, a dirty, torn white sock. It was caught on a bush, and just a little beyond it, something dark and cloth-like was tangled in a branch. I crossed carefully, boots slipping on the rocks. When I got closer, I saw it was part of a shirt, faded green, torn down the side. I froze, heart suddenly thudding. It wasn't that unusual for someone to lose clothing out here, but the shirt looked too fresh to have been there long. No moss, no weathering. I scanned the ground but didn't see anything else. No bag, no other clothes, no bones or anything like that. Still, it gave me a weird feeling, like I wasn't the first person to camp here recently. I brought the shirt back to camp and left it near my fire pit. I didn't know why. Maybe I thought I'd pack it out when I left. But all afternoon I kept glancing at it, thinking about how out of place it felt. That night I barely slept. I heard more noises closer than before, crunching footsteps. I sat up inside the tent, clutching my hatchet. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow pass across the tent wall, just for a second, like something moving between me and the firelight. But I couldn't be sure. I wanted to open the flap, but I was too afraid. I stayed like that for hours until the darkness started to lighten again. When I stepped outside at dawn, the fire was out, and the shirt I had left near it was gone. I stood there, staring at the empty ground, trying to make sense of it. Wind maybe? An animal? But it hadn't been windy, and I'd weighed it down with a small rock. That's when I noticed something else. The woodpile I'd stacked the day before was scattered, not just fallen over, but tossed. Some logs were several feet away. That wasn't the wind. That was someone or something digging through it. I packed that morning, fast, threw everything into my pack without folding it. My plan was to hike out and drive home as soon as possible. I didn't even eat breakfast, but about a half hour into my hike, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. There was a boot print on the trail ahead of me. Not mine. Bigger, deeper, fresh. I stopped walking, looked around, listened. The woods were silent. I thought maybe it was an old print I hadn't noticed on the way in, but the dirt had been rained on 2 nights ago. The edges of the print were sharp. No smudging, no leaves blown over it. Someone had walked this path after I arrived. I kept going, faster now, checking behind me every few minutes. My mouth was dry. I was sweating even though the air was cool. Every bird call sounded like a signal. Every rustle in the underbrush made me flinch. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. About halfway to my car, I noticed something else. A tree near the path had fresh cuts in the bark. 3 long, vertical gouges, like someone had dragged a blade across it. Not a claw mark, these were clean and deliberate. I passed another tree like that a few minutes later. Then another. I don't know if I was being followed or if someone had been marking the trail behind me. Either way, I was done. I reached my car just before noon. Everything looked untouched. I threw my pack in the back, got behind the wheel, and didn't even change out of my boots. I drove with the windows up, heart pounding until I hit pavement again. I didn't stop until I got home. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside my apartment made me sit up. I kept thinking about the shirt, the boot prints, the scattered wood, the marks in the trees. Someone had been out there with me, watching, maybe even coming into my camp at night. And if they were willing to come that close, to take something from right next to my fire, who knows what else they might have done. The next day, I reported it. I called the local forest ranger's office and told them everything. What I saw, what I heard, where I camped. They took it seriously, sent someone to check. A few days later, one of them called me back. He said they found the clearing, found my old fire pit, but there was no shirt, no signs of people, no fresh prints, just some slash marks on the trees. He said it was probably an animal or maybe a hunter passing through. Nothing to worry about, that I was probably just on edge from being alone out there. But I know what I heard, I know what I saw, and I haven't gone camping alone since. I was 34 the year I decided to spend a week alone in the woods of northern Minnesota. It was early September, just after Labor Day, when most families had already returned home, and the popular trails and campgrounds had emptied out. I wanted space and quiet. I wanted the sound of wind through trees, water against rocks, and nothing else. No talking, no phones, no deadlines. Just me, my gear, and the forest. I had done a fair amount of solo hiking before, but this time I picked a spot even more remote than usual. An area near the Canadian border, inside Superior National Forest, several miles off any marked trails. The only reason I even found the spot was from a blog post some guy wrote 3 years ago, outlining a multi-day off-trail route through the area. It sounded perfect. Secluded lakes, rough terrain, almost no cell service, and the sort of silence I had been craving for months. I packed everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, camp stove, dehydrated food, water filter, compass, topo maps, satellite emergency beacon, the usual first aid gear, and a good folding knife. I had planned for a full week. I drove up from Minneapolis, spent the night in a cheap motel near Ely, and hit the trailhead before sunrise the next morning. The sky was still dark blue when I stepped into the woods, following a narrow game trail that faded in and out as I pushed deeper into the trees. The first day was uneventful. It took me about 5 hours of hiking to get away from anything resembling a real trail. The terrain was rugged. Lots of uneven rock, dense pine and birch, and patches of soggy ground that tried to suck the boots right off my feet. Around late afternoon, I found a flat patch of dry ground near a small lake, maybe 100 feet across. I set up my tent, filtered some water, cooked a simple meal, and listened to the loons calling out across the lake. I felt calm. I felt like I'd finally found the silence I was looking for. It was the second day that I first noticed something was off. I had hiked north a couple miles, following the rough outline I'd made on my map. Around midday, I came across a strange clearing. Not a natural meadow, not a marsh, just a flat, bare area of ground maybe 30 feet wide, covered in dead grass and small rocks. It was surrounded by trees like the rest of the forest, but something about it felt wrong. Too open, too quiet. I stood there for a minute, taking it in, and realized I couldn't hear anything. Not the wind, not birds, not insects, just dead, still air pressing against my ears. I walked around the edge and kept moving, but the silence stuck with me for hours. That night, I camped near another small lake. It was even quieter than the first, tucked into a bowl of rock and pine. As I set up my tent, I felt like I was being watched. I chalked it up to nerves. I had barely seen a single person since leaving the car, and I was far from anything familiar. It was probably just the isolation getting into my head. Still, I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard small noises, branches snapping, soft rustling in the underbrush, faint thuds that sounded like footsteps. I kept unzipping the tent door and flashing my light outside, but I never saw anything. No animals, no people, just trees swaying in the dark. On the third morning, I woke up with the feeling that someone had been near my tent. The pine needles around the entrance were disturbed, not in any clear pattern, but in a way that felt wrong. I told myself it could have been an animal sniffing around, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but there were no prints. Just a faint line of shifted needles and 2 scuffed patches of dirt that almost looked like the front edge of a shoe had pushed through. I packed up quickly and hiked for hours that day, trying to put distance between me and whatever had been around my camp. The map led me deeper into the forest, past a series of rocky ridges and narrow creeks. The terrain got harder, with steep slopes and thick brush that tore at my legs and arms. By evening, I found a decent campsite near a cold, fast-moving stream and set up again. That night, I stayed awake, holding the knife in one hand inside my sleeping bag. I didn't light a fire. I didn't cook anything. I sat inside the tent, listening. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the unmistakable sound of a footstep. Not an animal, a real, deliberate step. It came from just beyond the edge of the stream, maybe 20 feet from the tent. Then another, then nothing. I stayed absolutely still, barely breathing, waiting for something else. Another footstep, a sound, anything. But there was just silence again. After a long time, I finally fell asleep from exhaustion. When I woke up the next morning, I walked to the other side of the stream. I didn't find any footprints, but I saw that some of the rocks along the edge had been moved. Small ones, like someone had tested their footing to cross. Again, no animal would have done that. Not like that. I started to feel like I was being followed. Not just watched, but actively tracked. Every day, I'd hike further into the woods, taking strange routes, doubling back, making sudden turns. But every night, something or someone was near me. I stopped finding signs in the dirt or pine needles, but I felt it. I'd hear faint noises that never led to anything. I'd feel like something was just out of sight. I stopped sleeping more than an hour or 2 each night. On the 5th day, I made a decision to cut the trip short and head south, back toward the trailhead. I was more than 10 miles from my car, but I thought I could make it in 2 long days if I pushed hard. I didn't care about finishing the planned loop anymore. I just wanted out of the woods. That night, I found a small patch of flat ground on a ridge overlooking a narrow ravine. It was exposed, which made me feel a little safer. If anything came near, I might hear it coming. I ate a cold dinner and stayed alert until after midnight before finally falling asleep for a while. I woke up at dawn to the smell of smoke. For a few seconds, I thought I'd started a fire in my sleep, but there was no fire, just the scent of old wood smoke drifting on the wind. I unzipped the tent and looked around. Nothing. No sign of a campfire, no people. But the smell was strong, sharp, acrid, like someone had burned something nearby. I packed up in record time and started hiking south without eating. I didn't stop all morning, just kept moving through thick brush and uneven ground, trying to stay focused and not panic. By late afternoon, I found an old logging road, not on my map, but heading roughly in the right direction. I followed it for a few miles, moving fast. It was overgrown and full of ruts, but easier than pushing through the woods. That night, I camped just off the road behind a thick stand of trees, and I tried to sleep with my pack inside the tent and the knife still in my hand. I had the worst dream of my life that night. I was standing in the clearing from the second day, the one with the dead grass, and there was something in the middle of it, just a black shape kneeling with its head down. I couldn't move or speak. I just stood there watching it, and the longer I looked, the more it felt like it was looking back. Then I woke up drenched in sweat, heart racing. That was the last night I camped. The next day, I followed the logging road until it met a proper trail, and from there I made my way back to the parking lot where I'd left my car. The entire hike back, I didn't stop once. I barely drank water. I just kept walking, waiting to see a figure on the trail behind me or hear a footstep that didn't belong. But I made it out. I got to my car, got in, locked the doors, and didn't stop driving until I hit a gas station 3 hours south. I didn't call the police. I didn't report anything. I didn't even tell anyone about it for weeks. What could I say? I saw nothing. I heard footsteps, smelled smoke, felt watched. It sounded like paranoia. Maybe it was. But I know what I felt out there. I know the difference between being alone and being followed. I never went back to that forest. I still camp, but not alone, and never that far from a road. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed another night, or taken a different trail, or tried to find the source of the smoke. But I didn't. I trusted my gut and I got out. The thing that sticks with me the most isn't the sounds or the smoke or the dream. It's that clearing, that strange, silent patch of land with the dead grass and the wrong feeling. I keep thinking maybe that was the start of it. Maybe I wasn't followed. Maybe I just wandered into someone's space. Someone who didn't want me there. Whatever it was, it let me leave, and I don't ever plan on going back. I had been looking forward to getting away for a while. The year had been long, and I felt like I hadn't had a moment to myself in months. Work was draining, and even though I lived alone in a small apartment in downtown Louisville, I felt crowded all the time. The city had started to feel like it was closing in on me. Sirens every night, crowded sidewalks, loud neighbors, the constant noise from traffic. I missed silence. I missed the woods. I grew up hiking and camping with my dad in southern Indiana, not far from Hoosier National Forest. When I was younger, we used to go out every summer. Nothing fancy, just a tent, some simple meals, and a few days away from everything. My dad passed away 4 years ago, and I hadn't gone camping since. But something in me was itching for it again. I wanted the quiet, the smell of pine needles, the sound of wind pushing through the trees. I wanted to feel small in the middle of nowhere. So in late October of 2023, I cleared a long weekend and packed up. I decided to go to a lesser-known spot just outside the main trail system, about 30 miles east of Tell City. It wasn't an official campground, just a remote area I had bookmarked on an old map. I remembered my dad pointing it out once and saying, "There's a good place to disappear for a while." That stuck with me. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I had mentioned to a coworker that I was taking a camping trip, but I didn't give details. I wasn't trying to be mysterious. I just didn't think it mattered. I had a reliable truck, a well-stocked pack, and years of experience. I figured I'd be fine. I left early on a Friday morning. The air was cool and dry. The trees were already halfway bare, and the roads were quiet. I took a few back roads, winding through small towns and open fields until the pavement gave way to dirt and gravel. After about an hour of driving through the forest, I pulled over at a clearing that looked like it hadn't been touched in a while. The ground was soft, covered in dry leaves and pine needles. Felt perfect. I parked the truck off the trail out of sight and hoisted my pack over my shoulders. I hiked in about 2 miles, deeper into the woods, until I found a flat area near a stream. It wasn't visible from any trail, and the trees were thick enough to keep me hidden. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and started to settle in. The first day was peaceful. I spent most of it walking along the stream, taking pictures of the trees and sky. I made a small fire that evening, ate some jerky and dried fruit, and sat quietly until the stars came out. It was cold, but not freezing. I bundled up in my sleeping bag and fell asleep to the sound of water moving slowly over rocks. The second day started just as calm. I woke up with the sun and made some coffee on my little camp stove. I planned to hike a wide loop around the area, just exploring and seeing what I could find. The air was colder that morning, and I noticed a thin layer of frost on the leaves. I had gloves and a warm jacket, so it didn't bother me much. I brought a day pack with some food, water, and a knife, and I started walking. About an hour into the hike, I noticed something strange. There was a cut tree stump, but not an old one, fresh. The wood was still light and clean, and there were sawdust flakes on the ground. That didn't sit right with me. I wasn't anywhere near a logging area, and this tree wasn't along any marked trail. It was tucked into a thicket, surrounded by underbrush. The cut was clean, too clean to be done with an axe. It looked like it had been done with a chainsaw recently. I didn't see any tire tracks or signs of a vehicle. That puzzled me, but I brushed it off. Maybe a hunter clearing a line of sight. I kept walking. Then I found another one, about 50 yards away. Same thing, fresh stump, clean cut, no signs of equipment nearby. I felt the first hint of unease then. The woods are usually filled with signs of life. Squirrels rustling in the brush, birds calling out, branches cracking in the wind, but the air felt still, too still. I stopped and listened. Nothing. No breeze, no birds, not even the sound of the stream in the distance. I decided to circle back to camp, sticking to a different route. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but something in my chest felt tight. I kept scanning the woods around me, looking for movement, but everything was still. When I got back to camp, something was off. My tent was there, but my firewood pile was gone. Completely gone. Not scattered or kicked over, just gone. I know I had stacked it carefully beside a large rock the night before. There were drag marks in the dirt, leading away from the site. They stopped after a few feet and vanished into the underbrush. I stood there for a while, staring at the empty spot. It didn't make sense. An animal might mess with food or dig through trash, but firewood? And there was no sign of the bag I kept it in. I checked my pack. Nothing was missing. The tent was still zipped. No signs of a break-in, but I felt watched. I felt it like pressure on my back. I stayed close to camp for the rest of the day. I didn't light a fire. I sat with my back to a tree, knife in hand, listening to the forest. Still no birds, still no breeze, just the occasional creak of branches high above me. As the sun started to go down, the temperature dropped quickly. I crawled into the tent early and zipped up tight. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing sounds, soft footsteps, twigs snapping, leaves crunching. Every time I unzipped the tent and looked outside, there was nothing. I started to think I was imagining things, but the sounds came from different directions every time. Once I heard a sharp crack, like a branch being broken in half nearby. My heart pounded for hours. I kept my knife beside me, gripped tight, eyes wide in the dark. Morning came slow. I hadn't slept more than a few minutes at a time. My hands were stiff from holding the knife. I made a quick decision. I was going to pack up and leave. Something wasn't right. Whether it was a person, an animal, or just the woods playing tricks on me, I didn't want to find out. I started packing, and that's when I saw the first boot print. It wasn't mine. It was larger and deeper, pointing toward my tent. I followed them carefully. There were 3, maybe 4 prints, spaced out in a way that suggested slow, deliberate walking. They disappeared into the undergrowth. That was enough. I packed everything fast, tossing gear into my bag without caring about the order. I didn't eat, didn't stop, just hiked straight back toward the truck. My body was on high alert the entire way. Every sound made me jump. I kept checking behind me, expecting to see someone there. When I reached the truck, my stomach dropped. There were smudges on the driver's side window. Greasy, vague fingerprints. The door was still locked, but I could tell someone had been there. I unlocked it, threw my gear in the back, and started the engine. I didn't stop driving until I hit pavement. I made it home by late afternoon. I parked in the garage, locked every door, and didn't unpack until the next day. For the next week, I barely slept. I kept the lights on at night. I kept checking the windows. I told myself it was just a random hunter, maybe someone living off-grid who didn't like visitors. But that didn't explain the firewood, the boot prints, the way the forest went silent. 3 weeks later, I saw something on the local news, a missing persons report. A man named Gary Nolan, age 41, last seen camping in Hoosier National Forest. They found his truck parked off a fire road not far from where I had been. That hit me like a punch to the chest. No signs of a struggle, no sign of where he went. Just disappeared. That was the last time I went camping alone. I still hike sometimes, but I stay on the main trails. I tell people exactly where I'm going. I carry a GPS tracker now, and I never sleep in the woods without a locked vehicle nearby. There was no ghost out there, no monster, just something or someone that knew the forest better than I did. Someone who moved through it without sound. Someone who watched. I think about it every time I close my eyes in a quiet room. The way the woods went silent. The way something changed around me. I was lucky. I got out. But someone else didn't. I decided to take a solo camping trip in mid-September. The summer crowd had thinned out, and the weather was still warm enough during the day but cool at night. I had a few days off work and needed time to clear my head. I'd done solo camping before, but never this far from home. This time, I picked a spot about 6 hours from where I lived, deep in the Allegheny Mountains in Pennsylvania. I found an isolated primitive campsite online, marked only by GPS coordinates and a couple vague reviews. The idea of total solitude appealed to me more than anything else at the time. I packed light but carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, a change of clothes, food, water, my knife, first aid kit, flashlight, batteries, a lighter, waterproof matches, and my old compass. I also had a paper map of the area just in case GPS didn't work. The drive up was peaceful. The further I got from town, the quieter the roads became. After a few hours, the paved highway turned into narrow, winding roads, then gravel paths surrounded by thick forest. Eventually, I found the unmarked dirt road that led to the site. I parked my car at the base of the trail, hidden behind a thick line of trees. I didn't want it easily visible from the road, just to be safe. From there, it was a hike up a hill and through about 2 miles of thick forest before reaching the campsite. The air was cool under the trees, and everything smelled like wet leaves and pine. I took my time getting there, pacing myself and enjoying the silence. The only sounds were the crunch of dead leaves under my boots, birds chirping in the distance, and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The campsite itself was perfect. It sat on a small ridge, surrounded on 3 sides by forest and overlooking a sloping valley. There was a natural fire pit made from stones, likely from previous campers, and a flat patch of ground just big enough for my tent. No signs of anyone else being there recently, no trash, no footprints, nothing. It felt untouched. I set up my tent just before sunset. After arranging my gear inside, I gathered wood and built a small fire. I ate a simple meal, jerky, crackers, and a granola bar, and sat by the flames for a while, watching the sky turn from orange to deep purple. The stars came out slowly, one by one, until they covered the sky. There was no light pollution at all, and I could see the Milky Way clearly above the treetops. I stayed up a little longer, enjoying the quiet. It felt good to be away from people, noise, and everything else. Eventually, the fire burned low, and I put it out completely before crawling into my sleeping bag. It took me a while to fall asleep, but I did. I woke up once during the night to pee. The forest was pitch black, and the air had turned colder. I stepped outside with my flashlight, walked a few steps from the tent, did what I had to do, and got back inside quickly. Nothing seemed out of place, but the woods felt different in the dark. More alive, more aware of me somehow. The next morning, I woke up to birdsong and golden sunlight coming through the tent fabric. I got up, stretched, and started boiling some water for coffee. While it heated up, I walked a little way into the woods to collect more kindling. I wandered farther than I meant to, not realizing how far I'd gone until I turned around and couldn't immediately see the clearing. I followed my trail back using broken twigs and the direction of the sun. When I returned, I noticed something odd right away. A rock near the edge of my fire pit had been moved. It wasn't a big rock, maybe the size of a football, but I had placed it myself the night before. It had been rolled a few feet to the side. I looked around, trying to tell if any animals had been by, but there were no tracks, no scratch marks, no fur, nothing disturbed around it. I figured maybe it had just rolled or shifted on its own. I let it go. The rest of the day was quiet. I read for a bit, walked along a small animal trail that looped around the ridge, and just sat enjoying the silence. I didn't see or hear a single person. Around late afternoon, I noticed something else. On a tree about 20 feet from my tent, there were fresh scratch marks. 3 parallel lines about a foot long, maybe chest height. They weren't deep, but they looked new. I didn't remember seeing them the day before. I studied them for a while. They looked too wide to be from a raccoon or squirrel, and too deliberate to be from a deer. I told myself it was probably a bear, but the height and spacing didn't make sense. Still, I didn't want to spook myself, so I ignored it. I didn't go far from camp after that. As soon as the sun dipped behind the trees, I got the fire going again and made another simple dinner. I sat closer to the flames that night and kept my flashlight nearby. I went to bed early. I laid there for a long time, listening. I could hear the wind in the trees and the occasional snap of a twig, but that was normal. What made me uneasy was the feeling that something was nearby. I couldn't explain it. It wasn't a noise or anything I could point to, just a tension in my chest, like being watched. I stayed awake much longer than the night before. I must have drifted off eventually, but it wasn't deep sleep. Sometime later, maybe 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up suddenly. I didn't hear anything at first, just silence. Then, I heard a soft crunch, like a boot stepping on leaves. Then another. It was close. My heart was pounding. I didn't move. I lay perfectly still in my sleeping bag, breathing as quietly as I could. More footsteps. Slow, deliberate. It didn't sound like an animal. Too heavy, too steady. They stopped just outside my tent. I waited. I didn't breathe. Couldn't. The footsteps started again, moving slowly around the tent. One full circle, then silence. I stayed frozen. I didn't dare unzip the tent or reach for my flashlight. I just lay there, muscles tensed, eyes wide open in the dark. Eventually, maybe after 20 minutes, maybe longer, I heard them move away. The sound faded into the woods. I stayed awake the rest of the night, not moving, ears straining for any sound. Nothing came back. When the sun rose, I got out of the tent, heart still racing. I checked around the site. No boot prints, nothing obvious. But the same rock from the fire pit had been moved again, this time farther away. And more scratch marks had appeared on the same tree, deeper this time. I packed up fast. I didn't cook breakfast. I stuffed everything into my backpack and hiked back to the car without stopping. I kept checking behind me, certain I'd see someone following. But the woods were quiet, just birds and wind. When I reached the car, it was exactly where I left it. No signs of tampering. I threw my pack in the back and drove without stopping, only relaxing when I hit pavement again. Back home, I tried to make sense of what happened. There were no other cars near that trail, no other people around, no signs of animals that could have done that. I didn't report it. What would I say? Weeks passed, then months. I didn't go camping again for a long time. Every time I thought about going back out, I remembered those footsteps, that slow, careful walk around my tent, the feeling of being watched. I still don't know who or what was out there, but it wasn't a bear. It wasn't a hiker. It was someone who didn't want to be seen, who came in the dead of night and circled my tent without a sound. Whoever it was didn't hurt me. They didn't take anything. They just let me know I wasn't alone out there. That was enough. I learned something on that trip. Nature isn't the only thing to be cautious of in the woods. Sometimes the scariest thing out there isn't the animals or the weather. It's other people. I still go camping now and then, but never alone, and never that far off the beaten path. I bring more than just a knife these days. I bring something louder, and I never, ever ignore strange sounds in the night. I took a week off work in late September 2022. I was 31 at the time and had been dealing with burnout from a stressful desk job in Denver. I'd been working remotely for almost 2 years, staring at the same four walls every day, barely seeing people, losing track of what day it was. I needed something that felt real again. No emails, no calls, no meetings, just space, silence, and trees. I decided to go camping in the mountains west of Gunnison, Colorado. I didn't want to stay in a campground or anywhere with other people. I wanted to be alone, off-grid, away from the crowds and noise. I'd done a lot of camping over the years, even solo trips, so I felt pretty confident in going out there alone. I picked a spot about 18 miles down a rough forest road, well beyond any maintained campgrounds. It was in a valley near a narrow creek, surrounded by thick pine trees and steep hills. I found it a few years ago while hiking and remembered thinking it would make a great place to camp someday. No cell service out there. Nothing but forest, rocks, and the occasional sound of birds or wind in the branches. I loaded up my Subaru with everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, propane stove, plenty of water, dried food, bear spray, extra layers, even a collapsible solar panel to keep my phone and GPS charged in case of emergency. I got to the trailhead just before noon on a Tuesday. The last stretch of road was rocky and washed out in places, and I had to take it slow, but eventually, I made it. The air was crisp and clean. That high-altitude fall smell was everywhere. Dry pine needles, cold soil, the last few golden leaves clinging to aspens. I hiked in a little over a mile from the trailhead, following a faint footpath down toward the creek. The spot I picked was flat, with good tree cover for wind protection and just enough sun during the day. I set up my tent beneath a cluster of tall spruces and took some time organizing everything. I gathered firewood, filtered some water from the creek, and set up a small cooking area with stones. I had a folding camp chair, a bear canister with all my food locked tight, and even brought a paperback novel to read by the fire at night. Everything felt perfect. That first night, I made a simple meal of rice and beans on the stove and ate while the sun dropped behind the ridge. The temperature fell fast. I threw on a jacket and gloves, then started a small fire and watched the flames flicker as the sky went dark. No sounds except for the creek and the occasional crack of a twig somewhere in the woods. Felt good, peaceful. I sat there for over an hour, just watching the fire and breathing in the cold mountain air. Then I put out the flames, zipped into my sleeping bag, and drifted off. The next couple of days followed a routine. I hiked around the valley, took photos, made food, gathered wood, and spent a lot of time just sitting by the water or lying in the sun. I saw deer, a marmot, and a hawk circling high above. No signs of people anywhere. I was completely alone. It was exactly what I'd wanted. But on the third night, things started to feel strange. I went to bed around 9 p.m. after reading for a bit by the fire. It was colder that night, and I could hear the wind picking up outside the tent. Around 1 a.m., I woke up to a sharp sound, like something hitting the outside of the tent. I froze, listened, nothing for a while. Then again, soft but distinct. A brushing sound, not an animal sniffing or scratching, more like something sliding slowly along the side of the tent wall. I didn't move. I just lay there, heart racing, every part of me on alert. I reached slowly for the can of bear spray by my head, gripping it tight. After maybe 5 minutes, it stopped. Total silence again. I waited another hour before I could fall back asleep. In the morning, I got out and checked the tent. Nothing. No marks, no tracks in the dirt. Maybe a branch blown by the wind, I told myself. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, close, watching. I forced myself to stick to my plan. I made oatmeal, drank coffee, and went for a hike. But the whole time I felt off, like I was being watched. That evening, I ate early and skipped the fire. The sky had gone overcast and it looked like rain. I climbed into the tent before it got fully dark, zipped up tight, and kept the bear spray within reach. I lay there listening. The wind came and went in gusts. A few raindrops tapped the tent. Around 11 p.m., I heard something again. A crack, a footstep, not an animal. Too heavy, deliberate. Then another. I held my breath, straining to hear. It sounded like a person walking in a wide arc around my campsite. Slow steps, stopping and starting. No flashlight, no voice, just steps in the dirt and leaves. I stayed frozen for over an hour, barely breathing. It eventually stopped, or maybe I fell asleep from sheer exhaustion. In the morning, I found faint boot prints near the edge of camp. Not mine. The treads were different. I wore trail runners with a narrow sole. These were heavier, maybe hiking boots or work boots. They circled the camp once, then disappeared into the woods. No gear, no sign of where they came from, just tracks. I stared at them for a long time, feeling my stomach twist. I decided to pack up that morning. I hadn't planned on leaving for another 3 days, but the thought of someone creeping around my camp at night killed any peace I had left. I stuffed everything into my backpack and started hiking back to the car. But halfway there, I realized I'd left my solar panel staked in a sunny clearing back near the tent. I thought about leaving it, but it was expensive and I didn't want to replace it. I dropped my pack by the trail and jogged back alone, following the same footpath I'd taken in. The forest felt different now, less friendly, like the trees were closing in. I reached the clearing and grabbed the panel, folded it up, and turned to head back. That's when I saw the small pile of rocks. It hadn't been there before. Someone had stacked them 5 or 6 high, right in the middle of the path. Not natural, deliberate. I stopped, heart thudding. Who the hell had been out here? I walked around the pile and headed back to the trail, this time at a fast walk. When I got to my pack, it had been moved. Not far, just a couple of feet off the trail, but I'd left it upright and it was now on its side. Nothing missing, nothing torn open. Just moved. That was enough. I didn't stop again until I reached the car. The drive back was tense. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone walking up the road. My hands were shaking on the wheel, and I didn't really relax until I saw the lights of Gunnison come into view. Back at home, I unpacked everything and checked my gear. No damage, no surprises, except for one thing. My camp journal was missing. I'd brought a small notebook where I was writing short notes every day, whether what I ate, where I hiked. Just small stuff. It had been in a side pocket of my backpack. I never took it out, but it was gone. I called the forest ranger office to report what happened. They took down the details, but said they couldn't do much without more evidence. It was public land. People hiked and camped there all the time. Maybe I'd imagined some of it. Maybe it was a hunter passing through. But I knew what I'd heard. I knew someone had been watching me. I still go camping, but never alone anymore. I stick to campgrounds or go with friends. That trip changed something in me. The forest used to feel like a safe place, quiet, still, a kind of escape. Now it feels different. Not because of bears or storms or anything wild, but because I learned the hard way that people, even far from civilization, are the real danger. I don't know who was out there with me that week. I don't know what they wanted, but they were quiet, patient, and close. Too close, and I was lucky to get out when I did. I think about that missing notebook sometimes. I wonder if they read it, if they followed me before that week, if they've done it to others. That feeling of being watched, of not being alone, it hasn't gone away. Even now, years later, I'll wake up in the middle of the night and listen for footsteps outside my window. And sometimes I think I hear them. I'd been meaning to take a solo camping trip for a long time. Life had been feeling too loud, too fast. My job was draining me. Long hours, deadlines, endless emails. I wanted quiet. I wanted to be away from people, away from buzzing phones and glowing screens. I didn't want to talk to anyone or hear anyone talk to me. I just wanted to sit in the woods, cook my food over a fire, sleep in a tent, and feel that calm that only comes from being far away from everything. It was late September 2022 when I finally got around to it. I took a Friday and Monday off work, giving myself a 4-day weekend. I live in Salem, Oregon, and I picked a remote spot deep in the Umpqua National Forest. I didn't want an official campground. I wanted to be alone, really alone. I spent hours on Google Maps, tracing Forest Service roads, looking at satellite views. I found a small clearing near a creek about 15 miles from the nearest paved road. There was no trailhead nearby, no cabins, nothing that would bring people in. Just trees and rocks and dirt. I packed my gear carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, bear canister, cooking stove, water filter, first aid kit. I brought a satellite messenger too, one of those little devices that can send out an SOS signal if something goes really wrong. I didn't think I'd need it, but I brought it anyway. I was prepared, or at least I thought I was. Friday morning, I got up before the sun, drove 6 hours south, then spent another hour creeping along a narrow dirt road that curved and dipped and rose through endless pine trees. My truck bounced over potholes and loose rocks, the branches scraping the sides like claws. I finally reached the spot around 3 in the afternoon. The clearing was maybe 40 feet wide, with tall grass and a few stumps. On one side, the creek ran through a rocky channel, fast and cold. The trees were thick all around, towering Douglas firs and ponderosa pines, their trunks straight as poles. I turned off the engine and stepped out into stillness. I set up my tent near the tree line, where the ground was flat. I found a good spot for a fire pit and cleared away the dry grass. There were no fire restrictions that late in the season, but I was careful anyway. I laid out rocks in a circle, dug down a little, and gathered dry wood from the surrounding forest. I used my knife to shave kindling from a dead branch, then lit it with a match. The fire crackled and popped, the smell of burning pine drifting through the air. That first night was perfect. I cooked a simple meal, rice and beans with some hot sauce, nothing fancy but warm and filling. I sat by the fire with a cup of tea, staring into the flames until the stars came out. The forest was dark and deep, but I wasn't afraid. I felt safe out there, away from everything. I went to bed early, the cold creeping into my sleeping bag, the creek whispering outside. I slept hard. No dreams, just a solid blackness until the sun came through the tent walls. I got up, made coffee, and went exploring. I followed the creek upstream, stepping over logs and stones, moving slowly. I saw deer tracks in the mud, small piles of scat, birds darting between branches. I didn't see another human, didn't hear a plane overhead, just the forest and me. Later that day, I hiked further into the woods, a small day pack on my back. I followed a game trail up a ridge, getting a better view of the landscape. Hills rolled in every direction, forested and wild. The sky was pale blue, cloudless. It was everything I'd hoped for. That night, the wind picked up. I could hear it moving through the trees like a wave. The fire danced wildly, and I had to stack a few rocks around it to keep it from blowing sparks. Still, I wasn't worried. I camped in worse weather. I went to bed with the sound of branches swaying above me, feeling a little uneasy for the first time, but I told myself it was just the wind. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up needing to pee. I unzipped the tent slowly, trying not to let in too much cold air, and stepped out into the night. The moon was up, bright enough to cast shadows. The trees swayed in the wind, creaking softly. I walked a little way from the tent, did my business, and stood there for a moment, listening. That's when I heard it. It was a soft thud, then another. Not loud, not close. It came from somewhere in the trees, past the creek. I stood still, holding my breath. The wind covered everything, but in the moments of calm between gusts, I heard it again. A soft, rhythmic thud, like someone stepping on soft ground. Then silence. I told myself it was an animal. Maybe a deer, maybe a bear. I had food stored in a bear canister, far from the tent. I'd done everything right. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was nearby, watching. I got back in the tent and zipped it shut. I lay there, eyes open, listening. Nothing but wind and the creek. Eventually, I fell asleep again, but it wasn't restful. The next morning, I walked across the creek and into the trees. I looked for tracks, but the forest floor was covered in needles and moss. No prints, no signs of anything. I pushed deeper in, maybe 100 yards. I didn't find anything, but that feeling stuck with me. That something had been moving out there in the dark. The third day, things started to feel wrong. It was little stuff at first. I noticed that my backpack, which I'd left under the tarp near the fire pit, had been moved. Not far, just a foot or two. Maybe I knocked it over without noticing. Couldn't be sure. Later, I found that my bundle of firewood had been scattered. A few pieces were missing. I assumed an animal had dragged them off, but they weren't chewed or broken, just gone. That night, I kept the fire going longer, letting the coals burn down before I crawled into the tent. I lay there with the flashlight in my hand, not scared exactly, just alert. I was listening for that sound again, that soft thudding. I didn't hear it, not right away, but sometime after midnight, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't the wind. It was a snapping sound, a sharp crack like a branch breaking underfoot. It came from the same direction, across the creek in the trees. I sat up, heart pounding. I turned off the flashlight and waited. Another snap, then silence. I didn't sleep much after that. I lay there thinking about bears, mountain lions, even people. I didn't want to believe it was a person. That was worse, somehow. A wild animal is predictable. A person out here wandering around at night, not making their presence known. That didn't sit right. The next morning, I made a decision. I was going to leave a day early. I didn't want to overreact, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I packed slowly, trying to stay calm. I still had one more night to get through before I could hike out in the morning. I spent the day gathering more wood, making sure my gear was organized, everything ready for a quick exit. That evening, I built a bigger fire. I cooked a full meal, trying to feel normal, trying to convince myself that I was being paranoid. But the feeling wouldn't go away. I kept looking into the trees, listening for any sound that didn't belong. At dusk, I did one last check around the campsite. That's when I saw the tree. About 30 feet from my tent, one of the smaller pines had fresh marks on the trunk. Long, vertical scrapes in the bark about waist high. Not claw marks. They were too deliberate, like someone had taken a knife or a hatchet to it. I hadn't noticed it before, and I was sure it hadn't been there when I set up camp. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed up by the fire, wrapped in my jacket, holding my knife. Every sound made my skin crawl. At some point, long after midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. Closer this time. On my side of the creek. I stood up, heart hammering. I didn't call out. I didn't move. I just listened. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard something even worse. The sound of breathing. Slow, quiet, but unmistakable. Someone was standing out there in the trees, watching. I didn't wait. I grabbed my headlamp, my pack, and the satellite messenger. I left the tent and most of my gear behind. I didn't care. I just started walking, fast, back down the dirt road. My headlamp bounced in the dark, throwing shadows in every direction. I walked for hours, never stopping. The woods were silent behind me, but I kept looking over my shoulder. I made it to my truck just before sunrise. I didn't sleep. I just drove, windows down, eyes wide, checking the rearview mirror every few minutes. When I got home, I reported what happened to the Forest Service. They said they'd send someone out to check the area, but they didn't seem surprised. I never heard anything back. I still go hiking. I still camp sometimes, but never alone. Not anymore. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I know this: something watched me in those woods. Something moved through the trees at night, silent and patient. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't my imagination. It was real, and I was lucky to get out when I did. My name is Ben Keller. I'm 33 years old now, but the story I'm about to tell happened in the fall of 2019. It took place in northern Idaho, not far from the Canadian border, in a remote area called Coldwater Ridge. I hadn't planned on going out there. It wasn't some long-awaited trip or special getaway. The cabin wasn't even mine. It belonged to my older cousin, Matt. He had bought it the year before, planning to turn it into a hunting base or maybe a vacation rental. But he never really got around to doing anything with it, and after his divorce, he didn't want to deal with it at all. He offered it to me for a week if I wanted to get away. At the time, I was burnt out from work and needed to be alone for a while. I accepted without thinking too hard about it. I should have asked more questions. Coldwater Ridge wasn't the kind of place you stumbled onto by accident. It sat high above a small town called Bonner's Hollow, about an hour of uphill driving from the nearest paved road. You had to pass through 2 rusted-out metal gates, then wind through about 6 miles of overgrown trail until you reached the base of a steep incline that led to the ridge. The trail was narrow and uneven. At some points, I wasn't sure my old Jeep Wrangler would make it, but somehow it did. The cabin itself was rough. Not dangerous, but definitely not the kind of place you'd want to stay in if you were expecting comfort. It was a single-room log structure, probably 20 by 30 feet at most. There was a small wood-burning stove in the corner, a fold-out cot, a rickety table, and one dusty window with a warped frame that barely closed. The air inside smelled like old wood and dried pine needles, with a faint scent of mildew. No electricity, no plumbing, no insulation. Just 4 walls and a roof. The view, though, was incredible. The ridge overlooked a valley that stretched out into the mountains. It was late September, and the leaves had already started turning. Reds, oranges, and yellows blanketed the hills like fire. There was a stillness in the air, the kind you only get when you're far from everything. No buzzing from power lines, no traffic, no people yelling in the distance. Just wind and trees. I unloaded my gear. 1 backpack with clothes, a sleeping bag, a box of freeze-dried food, and a cooler full of water and a few beers. I brought a flashlight, 2 books, and my phone, though I had no signal the second I passed through the second gate. I didn't bring a gun. In hindsight, that was stupid. I don't hunt, and I figured bear spray would be enough. It wasn't. The first day was quiet. I walked the perimeter of the ridge, taking in the silence and the rawness of the place. There were no other cabins nearby, no fire pits, no signs of life really, just endless trees and steep cliffs on the northern side. I sat on the edge of the ridge that night and watched the sunset. The sky turned pink and gold, and for a little while I felt at peace. I ate a pack of chili mac and went to sleep on the cot, listening to the wind scrape against the logs. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. It wasn't a loud sound, just something soft and out of place. I stayed still, ears open. Then I heard it again, a scraping noise. Not the wind this time. This was slower, more deliberate. It was coming from behind the cabin, maybe 10 or 15 feet away. I held my breath and sat up slowly, reaching for my flashlight. I didn't turn it on. I just waited. The sound came again, closer now, like something dragging along the outside wall. At first, I thought maybe it was an animal, a raccoon or porcupine, maybe, but the steps, if that's what they were, sounded heavy, slow. For steps, then a pause, then 3 more, right along the back wall, heading toward the side window. I stood up, careful not to knock over the cot, and crept toward the window. The glass was cloudy, so I couldn't see clearly, but I stared out, holding the flashlight like a weapon, ready to swing. The steps stopped. Total silence. I stayed like that for almost an hour. Nothing moved. Eventually, I told myself it had to be an animal and climbed back into the sleeping bag. But I didn't fall asleep again. Not that night. The next morning, I circled the cabin looking for prints or marks. The ground was hard and dry. No mud, no snow yet, so there weren't any tracks. I looked for claw marks on the logs. Nothing. I tried to brush it off, but my gut said something was off. I kept checking over my shoulder the rest of the day. That afternoon, I walked a mile or so downhill to find a spring Matt told me about. It was supposed to be the only fresh water source nearby. I brought a small filter pump and refilled my bottles. On the way back up, I saw something that stopped me cold. About halfway up the trail, I noticed a tree with deep cuts in the bark. Long gouges vertical about shoulder height. I've seen what bear marks look like. These weren't those. They were too narrow, too straight, and there were 5 of them evenly spaced like fingers. I told myself it could have been someone playing a joke, or maybe a hunter marking territory. But why way out here? I made it back to the cabin and tried to shake it off. I boiled water, ate another meal, and sat on the edge of the ridge again, but I didn't feel peaceful this time. I felt watched. That night, I locked the door, though it was just a wooden latch, and jammed the chair under the knob. I kept the flashlight in one hand and the bear spray in the other. I didn't sleep. Around midnight, I heard something again. Not footsteps this time, breathing. It was coming from just outside the front wall. Heavy, labored breathing, like someone who'd been running and had stopped to catch their breath. It went on for 5 minutes, then stopped. I sat there in the dark, muscles cramped, my eyes burning from staying open. I didn't move until the sun came up. I knew I should have left that morning, packed my gear and driven out, but I was stubborn. I didn't want to admit that something was wrong, or that I was scared. I told myself I'd stay one more night, then leave. I couldn't explain what was happening. Maybe I was just exhausted. Maybe I was freaking myself out. That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I chopped some wood with the dull axe mat left behind. I tried reading, but I couldn't focus. My ears kept picking up sounds that didn't belong. Snaps, cracks, distant whistles. At one point, I thought I saw something move in the trees about 50 yards out. A flash of dark green or black. But when I looked directly at it, nothing was there. At sunset, I built a fire in the old stone pit outside the cabin. I sat next to it for a while, hoping the light would make me feel safer. But it didn't. It just made the shadows deeper. When it got dark enough, I put the fire out and went back inside. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something slam into the side of the cabin. It was loud enough to knock dust from the rafters. I jumped up, heart pounding, flashlight shaking in my hand. Another slam, then silence. I moved to the window and aimed the light outside. Nothing. I couldn't see anything but the trees. Then I heard the breathing again. This time it was closer, just on the other side of the wall. And then something worse, scraping again. Not along the wall this time, but across the roof. Slow, dragging sounds. Something or someone was up there. I bolted out the door, flashlight in one hand, bear spray in the other. I aimed the light at the roof. Nothing. But when I turned around, I saw it. There was a man standing at the edge of the trees. He wasn't holding a weapon. He didn't move. He just stood there watching me. He wore a hooded jacket and old jeans. His face was shadowed. I couldn't make out details, just the outline. I raised the bear spray and stepped back toward the door. He didn't move. I went inside, locked the door, and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By morning, he was gone. I packed everything I had and shoved it into the Jeep. I didn't eat. I didn't take one last look at the view. I just drove. I made it to Bonner's Hollow by mid-afternoon and went straight to the sheriff's office. I told them everything. They listened, took some notes, then told me they'd send someone up in a few days to check it out. But they didn't seem too concerned. One of the deputies asked if maybe I'd seen a squatter or poacher. That was it. I never went back to the cabin. Matt sold it 6 months later. I don't know who bought it. I don't think I was the first person that man watched. And I don't think I would have left the ridge if I'd stayed one more night. I learned something important up there. The wilderness isn't just trees and trails and fresh air. Sometimes, it's the perfect place for people to hide. People who don't want to be found. People who watch. People who wait. And sometimes you don't find out why until it's too late. But I got out. I got out before whatever was going to happen happened. And that's enough for me. It was mid-October when I arrived at the cabin. My name is David, and I'm 32 years old. I had been working a desk job for years, and the stress had built up. After one too many sleepless nights, I decided to take a break and escape to the wilderness. A friend of mine had recommended this cabin, a place nestled deep in the woods about a 3-hour drive from the nearest town. The location was remote, perfect for some time away from the world. I had planned on being there for 5 days. The cabin was supposed to be a simple, no-frills kind of place, built for those who wanted to disconnect completely. It didn't have electricity, but there was a wood stove for heat and a small propane-powered fridge. There was a small lake nearby, surrounded by trees that had begun to show their autumn colors. It sounded like the perfect place to recharge. The drive there was scenic but also unsettling. The farther I went, the fewer signs of life I saw. Small towns were scattered here and there, but they were all quiet and almost deserted. As I drove deeper into the woods, the path became more of a dirt trail than an actual road. I passed through dense trees that blocked most of the sunlight, and the whole place had an eerie stillness to it. It felt like the world around me was holding its breath. Eventually, I reached the cabin. It was everything I expected. A small, weathered building made of dark wood, with a slanted roof and a porch that sagged slightly. There was a small shed off to the side, and the lake could be seen just beyond the trees. I parked the car, grabbed my bags, and made my way inside. The interior was simple but cozy. A wood stove sat in the center of the room, and there were a few mismatched chairs around an old wooden table. The walls were lined with bookshelves, though most of the books looked like they hadn't been touched in years. A small window looked out over the lake, which was now hidden behind the thickening fog. The silence inside was overwhelming, almost like it had a weight to it. I started a fire in the stove, unpacked my things, and settled in for the evening. The air outside was chilly, and the wind began to pick up, howling through the trees. It felt like the cabin was in the eye of a storm, as if the world outside was becoming more wild, while I was enclosed in this little haven of warmth and solitude. That night, I tried to sleep, but something about the place kept me awake. It wasn't just the unfamiliar creaks and groans of the old cabin. There was something else, a faint noise just beyond the edge of my hearing. Every now and then, I thought I heard footsteps outside, or a branch scraping against the window. At first, I brushed it off as the wind or an animal, but as the night wore on, the sounds seemed too deliberate, too intentional. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the sound of the wind outside like a constant rush of water in my ears. After a while, I convinced myself that I was just being paranoid. I was alone in the middle of nowhere, and everything was fine. Yet, the unease remained. The next morning, I woke up early to the sound of birds calling from the trees. The fog had lifted, and sunlight filtered through the trees in pale beams. It looked peaceful, almost idyllic. I made coffee and sat on the porch, enjoying the stillness. The world seemed to have reset overnight, as if it had forgiven me for my restless night. I decided to take a walk around the lake. The path was overgrown, but it was still easy enough to follow. The ground was damp with morning dew, and the air had that crisp, fresh quality that comes with being so far from civilization. The forest around me was thick, but I didn't feel scared, just isolated, as if I were the only one left in the world. As I walked, I noticed something strange. There was an odd marking on one of the trees near the water's edge. It looked like someone had carved a symbol into the bark. A circle with a line through the middle, almost like an old, forgotten language. I stepped closer to inspect it, but the closer I got, the more I felt uneasy, like I was being watched. I shrugged it off as some weird, random marking left by a hiker or someone else who had come through, but it was hard to ignore the growing sense of unease. I hurried back to the cabin and decided to spend the rest of the day inside, reading the books on the shelves and getting acquainted with the place. That night, the sounds outside returned. The same rustling and scraping, almost as if something or someone was moving around the cabin. This time, I didn't ignore it. I grabbed a flashlight, pulled on my jacket, and stepped out onto the porch. The air was thick with fog again, and the trees stood like dark silhouettes against the pale glow of the moon. The sounds came from the woods, just beyond the clearing. I stood there for a long moment trying to make sense of it. There was no wind, and the night was eerily still, but I could hear something moving, slow and deliberate. I shone the flashlight toward the trees, but the beam only pierced the fog for a few feet before it disappeared into the gloom. My heart began to race. The rational part of my mind told me it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the other part of me, the part that had started to feel like it wasn't alone, didn't believe that. I waited for a few more minutes, the only sounds now being my own breathing and the occasional rustle from the woods. Nothing emerged, and eventually, I went back inside, but sleep didn't come easy. The feeling of being watched lingered, and every creak of the cabin seemed amplified in the silence of the night. The next day, I made the decision to stay inside, avoiding the lake and the forest altogether. I read through some of the old books on the shelves and tried to distract myself. But the quiet started to get to me. It was too quiet. The only sounds I heard were my own movements and the crackling of the fire. It wasn't until the third night that things took a darker turn. I woke up to a loud bang coming from the back of the cabin. It sounded like something heavy had struck the wall, and it startled me out of my sleep. I immediately sat up in bed, heart pounding. I listened, but all I could hear was the wind howling through the trees and the creaking of the old cabin. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I was 34 when I took the trip. It was late October 2021. My name is Brian Mercer. I'm a freelance photographer, mostly doing work for real estate and nature magazines. I'd been living in Spokane, Washington for a few years by then, and I'd gotten into a habit of doing solo trips out to remote places whenever I felt burned out from editing and deadlines. That year, the burnout hit harder than usual. I had just wrapped up back-to-back contracts for 3 real estate firms and had barely stepped outside in weeks. I found the cabin listing on a website that hosts lesser-known rentals, especially off-grid types. It wasn't Airbnb, more niche. The place was on private land near Coldwater Lake, just southwest of Mount St. Helens. It was advertised as a true solitude experience, with no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and no neighbors for miles. The listing said it had solar panels for basic power and a well with a hand pump. The owner, a guy named Dennis, had a bunch of reviews from people who stayed there over the years. No red flags. I booked it for 6 nights. I left Spokane early on a Sunday morning. The drive took me about 6 hours with a few stops for gas and food. By the time I got close to the property, The road had narrowed to a winding gravel trail lined with tall pines. The elevation increased gradually, and the air turned crisp. I rolled down the window and took it in. It smelled like wet bark and dry leaves. My favorite kind of air. The last part of the road was barely a road at all. Just two narrow tire paths in the dirt. I followed the email directions exactly, past an old metal gate left open, and finally saw the cabin tucked between two steep ridges, maybe 100 yards back from the lake's edge. It was surrounded by evergreens on all sides, dense and dark, except in one direction where the water reflected the pale gray sky. The cabin itself was older than I expected, but solid. A-frame style with a small front porch, weathered wooden siding, and a metal chimney poking through the top. There was a steel fire pit off to the side with a few damp logs stacked nearby. Everything looked like it hadn't been touched in a while. That was fine with me. I wanted quiet, and that's what I got. Inside, the cabin had a single room with a loft above. The main floor had a wood stove, a cot with thick wool blankets, a table with 2 chairs, and a small kitchen with a propane stove and a hand-pumped sink. The fridge was a cooler box that drained into a bucket. No plumbing, no thermostat, no insulation. Just wood, nails, and space. The loft had a thin mattress and a dusty window that looked out toward the ridge. By the time I got settled and stacked my camera gear by the table, it was late afternoon. I didn't feel like shooting anything yet. I took a walk down to the lake instead, watching the clouds drift low over the water. The silence out there was heavier than I expected. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of silence where your ears ring and you notice every movement in the trees. I stood there for a while, letting the calm dig into me. The first night was uneventful. I lit a fire in the wood stove, heated some canned soup, and read a paperback until the warmth made me drowsy. I slept in the loft. The mattress was stiff and smelled like old pine, but I was tired enough not to care. I fell asleep to the sound of wind brushing against the siding. The second day, I started shooting. I walked the perimeter of the lake with my camera, stopping to photograph moss-covered stumps, ripples in the water, and clusters of red and gold leaves still clinging to their branches. I didn't see another person all day, not even a distant boat or a parked truck. It was total isolation. I liked it. That night, I was sitting outside by the fire pit around 8 p.m. I hadn't used it yet, just sitting on the edge with a headlamp on, editing photos on my laptop until the battery died. The temperature had dropped fast after sundown. My breath came out in little clouds. The trees around the clearing were black outlines now. I remember hearing something then, not close, not loud, but definitely out of place. It was a faint metallic clink, like a tool knocking against another, maybe a hammer or wrench. It came from somewhere up the ridge behind the cabin. I looked up instinctively, but all I saw was darkness. The ridge rose sharply about 150 feet behind the cabin and disappeared into heavy forest. No trails up that way, at least not marked ones. I listened for a while, but the sound didn't repeat. I told myself it was nothing. Could have been a branch falling onto a rock or something shifting in the cold. That area used to have logging operations decades ago. Maybe old junk was still up there. I turned in early that night, a little uneasy, but not enough to ruin the trip. The next day, I shot more photos in the opposite direction, trying to get a better angle on the ridge and the lake. I didn't think much about the noise from the night before until I found something strange while hiking back. About 30 yards uphill behind the cabin, I saw a narrow indentation in the ground, mostly covered by ferns and rotting leaves. It wasn't a trail exactly, but it looked like something had been regularly moving through there, flattening the plants in a straight line up the slope. Curious, I followed it for maybe 10 minutes until the incline got too steep and the brush too thick. I didn't find anything obvious. No shack, no campsite, nothing fresh. Still, the track was odd. Too narrow and too consistent to be an animal trail. It looked methodical. I made a mental note and turned back. That night, the sound came again. Same metallic clinking, same location. This time it lasted longer, maybe 5 or 6 faint taps in a row. I froze on the porch, ears straining. Then silence again. No footsteps, no voices, just that strange sound echoing off the trees and then nothing. I didn't sleep well. My brain kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe someone else was camping illegally on the ridge. Maybe a hunter was setting up a blind. Maybe it was just old junk shifting as the temperature dropped. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was up there moving around, watching, maybe. On the fourth day, I hiked around the ridge, trying to come at it from the west side where the incline wasn't so bad. I had my camera, a knife, and a pair of binoculars. I wasn't looking for trouble, just answers. The forest was dense, and the terrain rough. Fallen logs, thorny bushes, and loose rocks made it slow going. About halfway up, I found something that made my stomach flip. It was a tree, or rather, what someone had done to it. The trunk had been shaved flat on one side, and into the exposed wood, someone had carved dozens of straight lines, all parallel, all perfectly spaced. They weren't words or symbols, just lines. Rows and rows of them like tally marks but with no grouping. It must have taken hours. The bark shavings were still on the ground, pale and curling. It was recent. I backed off, suddenly aware of how quiet the woods were again. No birds, no insects, just wind and leaves. I didn't go higher. I turned around and got back to the cabin before dark. That night I stayed inside, locked the door, even though the listing had said there was no real need for it. I kept the fire small and the lights off. Around midnight, I heard footsteps on the gravel outside, slow, deliberate, crunching the rocks softly, like someone trying not to be noticed. They circled the cabin once, then nothing. I waited, clutching my knife, heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I didn't go to the window. I didn't want to see. By dawn, the footsteps were gone. No knock, no attempt to break in. Just a slow, quiet circle and silence. When I finally stepped outside that morning, I found one thing out of place. A single boot print, deep and wide, in the soft dirt behind the cabin. Too big to be mine, too fresh to be old. That was the turning point. I packed my gear and loaded the car. I didn't care if I had 2 nights left. I was done. But when I turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. The battery was dead. I tried again. Nothing. Not even a click. I popped the hood, checked the cables, everything looked fine. No obvious damage. I walked back to the cabin and tried to calm down. I didn't have cell service. The nearest road was a 2-hour hike downhill. I had enough food and water, but the idea of staying another night after what I'd seen, what I'd heard, was unbearable. I decided to hike out. I packed a bag with essentials, left a note in case someone found the cabin, and locked up. I left around 10 a.m., following the gravel path back down the hill. About an hour into the hike, I heard something behind me. Not close, not loud, just the unmistakable sound of footsteps on dry leaves. I stopped. They stopped. I waited. Nothing. Then I started walking again. They followed. This continued for almost a mile. Every time I stopped, the sound stopped. When I moved, it resumed, always at the edge of hearing. I never saw anyone. The forest was too thick. By the time I reached the gate at the bottom of the property, the sounds had stopped. The rest of the way to the highway was I'm writing this down because I've realized I never want to go back to a place like that again. Not just that cabin, but the whole idea of being out there alone. I used to think I needed isolation to think straight. I thought it would help me reset, clear my mind. But after that weekend at Split Birch Cabin, I learned that some things are better dealt with among people. Back in 2021, I was 34, living in Allentown, Pennsylvania. I had a job in software, freelance stuff mostly, so I could work from anywhere. I had gone through a rough year, lost my dad to a heart attack in February, and then a few months later, my relationship ended after 5 years. I needed a break from everything, and being around people just made it worse. Everyone had advice, but none of it felt helpful. That fall, I rented a small off-grid cabin in upstate New York, about 4 hours north of Albany. It was tucked away in the foothills of the Adirondacks, not far from Lake Harris, but not near any tourist trail either. The listing described it as perfect for solo retreats, solar power, a gravity-fed water system, and a wood stove for heat. It was surrounded by forest, with no cell signal and no neighbors for at least 3 miles. The nearest town, Newcomb, had a population under 500. The owner was an older guy named Ron who had converted an old hunting shack into something more livable. He met me in town at a diner parking lot, handed me a printed map, showed me where to turn off the highway, and then just said to follow the dirt path until I saw the split birch tree. The cabin would be just behind it. The drive from the diner to the cabin took nearly 40 minutes, the last stretch crawling along a barely visible trail. When I finally saw that forked birch tree, I was relieved. The cabin sat about 20 feet behind it, weathered pine siding, a tin roof that had seen better days, and one small window on each side. It didn't look like much, but it was solid. One room, a small porch, a fire pit, and an outhouse maybe 30 yards into the woods. It was late October, cold enough to see your breath in the mornings, but the snow hadn't started yet. The woods were mostly bare, the leaves having just dropped, so everything had that dead quiet that only fall brings. I liked it at first, the stillness, the kind of silence you only get when you're miles from anything. The first day, I unpacked, stacked some firewood beside the stove, set up my sleeping bag on the built-in cot, and made a quick dinner from canned soup. I had brought enough food for a week, mostly dry stuff, cans, a few fresh vegetables I planned to eat early. There was a manual pump for water in a small shed beside the cabin, and the tap ran cold and clean. That first night, I sat out on the porch under a thick blanket, sipping instant coffee from a thermos, listening to the wind. I remember thinking how right this felt. Just me and the woods. No phone, no one to talk to. I fell asleep quickly, the kind of sleep that hits you hard when there's no background noise. Just the creak of trees and the occasional rustle of animals. The second day, I hiked around the area to get my bearings. I didn't have GPS, but I had a compass and the printed map Ron had given me. I stayed within a mile of the cabin, following some game trails, checking out the streams. At one point, I thought I heard a low engine rumble, maybe an ATV or chainsaw, but it was so faint it could have been anything. I chalked it up to sound traveling strangely in the forest. That night, I woke up twice to noises outside. Sharp ones like a stick snapping, then something dragging across the ground. I sat up, heart thumping, and reached for my flashlight. The stove had burned low, and the cabin was cold. I peeked out the window and scanned the woods, but the beam caught nothing but trunks and shadows. Probably a raccoon or deer. I wasn't really scared. Not yet, but I did start locking the door after that, even though it was just a simple latch. By the third day, things began to feel a little off. I found boot prints in the dirt about 10 yards behind the cabin. They weren't mine. I had a very distinct tread on my hiking boots, and these were different. Heavier, wider set. I told myself it could have been Ron checking up on the place, though it didn't make much sense for him to hike in that far just to snoop around the back. Still, I had no real reason to be alarmed, so I let it go. That afternoon, while chopping wood, I noticed something strange further out, about 50 yards through the trees, something reflective glinting on the ground. I walked over and found a crumpled energy drink can, partially buried in the leaves. It wasn't mine. I hadn't brought any drinks like that. The label was faded, but the aluminum looked recent, no rust, no weathering. I carried it back and tossed it into my trash bag. Probably some hiker from earlier in the season, I figured, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been nearby recently. That night, I woke up again, this time to a low knocking. Not on the cabin, but faint, rhythmic thuds. I sat up slowly, waited, then heard them again. Not fast, not urgent, just steady, like something brushing or tapping. I pulled on my jacket, grabbed my flashlight again, and slowly opened the door. The woods were pitch dark, and colder than it had been the nights before. I stepped onto the porch and stood still, listening. Then I heard it, a dragging sound. Long, slow, maybe 30 feet to the left of the cabin. I shone the light in that direction and caught something moving just behind a cluster of trees. I froze. The light only reached so far, and whatever was there was just at the edge of it. A tall shape, maybe a person, maybe a deer, but it was standing upright. Then it ducked out of view. I backed into the cabin, closed the door, and sat against it for the next hour, flashlight in hand, until the sky began to lighten through the windows. I didn't sleep again that night. That morning, I walked out to the spot where I'd seen the shape. There were tracks, boot prints again, and a strange drag mark running alongside them, like someone had been pulling a heavy bag. I followed them for a short distance until they veered off down a hill and disappeared into a shallow creek bed. The water had disturbed the prints, and I lost the trail. I considered packing up and leaving, but I didn't want to admit defeat. I wasn't hurt, and technically nothing had happened. I told myself maybe it was a hunter or trapper passing through. Still, I started carrying my camping hatchet with me everywhere after that. That afternoon, I made a bigger fire than usual and sat outside late, just watching the woods. Every sound made me twitch. The wind rattling dead leaves, the thump of acorns falling, even the call of a barred owl. When I finally turned in, I wedged a chair under the doorknob, just to be sure. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate, then a scrape, like something being dragged across the wood floor outside. Then silence. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stayed there, eyes fixed on the door, listening. Then I heard the faintest click. Metal on metal. The latch. Whoever was out there tried to open the door. I gripped the hatchet, heart thudding so loud I thought it would give me away. But the latch held. A few minutes passed, and then I heard the steps retreating. Not running, just slow, steady steps crunching through the leaves, growing fainter, then gone. When the sun came up, I stepped out, hatchet in hand. The porch had scuff marks, long, wide grooves like something had been dragged across it. And there, sitting right at the edge, was a deer carcass. Its throat was slashed, but not cleanly, more like ripped open. Its legs had been broken. It had clearly been moved post-mortem. There were boot prints around it, fresh ones, deeper than before. Whoever left it wanted me to find it. That was enough. I packed everything in under 10 minutes. Food, water, sleeping bag. I didn't care if I left anything behind. I sprinted to the car, about a quarter mile up the path where I had to park it because the trail was too rough. I didn't look back. The car started without issue, and I drove like hell down the trail, bumping over rocks and ruts. I didn't slow down until I hit the paved road. Then I just kept going straight through to Albany, where I got a motel room and collapsed on the bed, fully clothed, still shaking. I called Ron from a gas station the next day, told him I left early and that I'd mail back the cabin key. I didn't explain. He didn't ask. I never went back. Never found out who was out there or why they were watching me or why they left that deer. I filed a report with the local sheriff's office, but without any damage, without a face. There wasn't much they could do. They said it was probably a poacher messing around. Maybe, but the way it all unfolded, it felt personal. Like I was being watched from the moment I arrived. It's been 4 years now. I still think about it sometimes, especially in the fall. I still hike, still camp sometimes, but never alone and never that deep in. People talk about how peaceful the woods are, but peace can turn on you real fast when you're alone and someone else is out there. Someone who knows the land better than you, who doesn't want you there. That weekend changed how I look at isolation. I went out there to escape people. What I found was a reminder that the scariest... My name is Evan Reed. I was 31 when this happened, summer of 2017. I lived in Spokane, Washington at the time, and I worked in maintenance for a community college. Not the worst job. Paid okay, quiet work. I'd just gotten out of a long relationship back then. For years with a woman I thought I'd marry, but things fell apart slowly, then all at once. You know how it goes. I needed time to clear my head, so I figured I'd do a solo trip. I'd camped plenty as a kid, and I'd done some solo trips before, though none more than a weekend. This time, I wanted something longer, just me and silence. I rented a small, off-grid cabin for 2 weeks up in northeastern Washington, near Colville National Forest. The cabin sat way back in the woods, about 5 miles from the nearest dirt road. You had to park your car at a clearing, then hike in with your gear. No electricity, no running water, just a wood stove, a rain barrel, and a composting toilet out back. The cabin was owned by some older guy named Murray, retired forestry worker. He built the place himself back in the 80s. I found it listed on some backwoods rental site. The pictures made it look perfect. Just a simple wooden structure with thick forest all around and a small creek nearby. I got there on a Wednesday afternoon in late July. It had been a dry summer, so the trail leading to the cabin was dusty and cracked. It took me nearly 2 hours to haul all my stuff in. 2 trips with my gear, cooler, tools, food, and a small solar charger I brought for my phone, though I knew there was no signal out there. When I finally stepped into the cabin, the heat hit me right away. It was stifling inside, and the windows had all been shut for who knows how long. Dust floated in the light beams cutting through the small front window. I opened every window and propped the door for airflow. The place was simple, just a twin bed, a table, a shelf with some old paperbacks, a few pots and pans, and a little wood stove in the corner. There was a logbook on the table with names and short entries going back 20 years. I flipped through a few. Most people had only stayed a couple nights. A few had left little hand-drawn maps of good hiking trails nearby. One guy had scribbled a whole page about watching a bobcat down by the creek. After settling in, I spent that first evening just unwinding. I cooked some pasta on my camp stove outside and sat on a log watching the sky turn orange. I remember the quiet, that kind of quiet you only get way out in the woods, where there's no hum of cars or appliances, just the occasional bird call, the wind through the trees, and your own breathing. The first night passed without anything strange. I slept hard, too hard actually. Woke up drenched in sweat around 2 a.m. because I forgot how warm those old sleeping bags get in summer. I got up, splashed water from the rain barrel on my face, then went back to bed. Took me a while to fall asleep again. Every little rustle outside the cabin set my ears up. A branch snapping, leaves crunching, normal wood stuff, but when you're alone, even a raccoon sounds like a person. The second day, I hiked around and found that creek maybe half a mile south of the cabin. The water was low but cold and clean. I filled up a few bottles and ran them through the filter I brought. I spotted deer tracks in the mud. Some small ones too, maybe a fawn. I also found what looked like a hunting blind up in a tree about 20 minutes from the cabin. It was old, falling apart, but it had good sight lines over a wide slope. I climbed up just to see, and when I looked back the way I'd come, I realized how easy it was to get turned around. Everything looked the same, green and brown and still. That evening I built a small fire in the pit outside and cooked sausages. Sat by the fire until it was just glowing coals. I watched the trees sway under the moonlight and felt that calm again. I remember thinking I could really spend a lot more time out there. Maybe I'd come back in the fall when it was cooler. The weird stuff didn't start until the third night. I woke up around 1:30 a.m. to a noise outside. Something fast and light, like feet moving across the leaves. Not a thud, more like a patter. I sat up, heart already going. I listened hard, holding my breath. There it was again. A quick rustle, then nothing. Now, I'm not the paranoid type, but I'm not stupid either. I knew animals came around cabins, raccoons, maybe even a bear if you left food out. But I'd been careful. Food was stored in a cooler, locked and weighted. Trash tied up and hung in a tree away from the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it out the window. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I opened the door slowly and stepped outside barefoot, flashlight in hand. I swept it around. Still nothing. Then I noticed something odd. The firewood I'd stacked on the side of the cabin had been moved. Not all of it, just enough that it looked wrong. 2 or 3 pieces had been taken from the middle of the stack and placed on the ground, a few feet away, like someone had pulled them out and then dropped them there. That's not something an animal would do. I knelt down and looked at the dirt. I thought I saw a print. Maybe a shoe, maybe just where the wood had fallen. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat inside with the flashlight on and my multi-tool in hand, listening. By morning, I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe I'd stacked the wood wrong and it fell. Maybe a deer kicked it. Still, I felt weird. I did a big loop hike that day to clear my head. Took about 4 hours through some rocky ridges to the north and back through thicker pine forest. Found some elk droppings and a weird metal box half buried in the dirt. Just an old toolbox, rusted shut. Probably a hunter left it there years ago. That night, I didn't light a fire. I sat inside and read an old paperback someone had left behind. Some western from the 70s. Around midnight, I turned in, but I didn't sleep well. At 3:12 a.m., I remember because I checked my watch, I heard tapping. Not knocking, tapping. On the side of the cabin. Soft, like someone drumming fingers on the wood. I froze. The sound moved. Tap, tap. Then a few seconds of silence. Then again on the back wall. Then the side window. I didn't move. I just listened, every muscle locked. Then nothing. No footsteps. No crunching leaves. Just silence. I stayed like that for an hour until the sun started to rise. That morning I checked around the cabin. No tracks. No marks. But again, something small was off. My pack, the one I'd left just inside the door, was now sitting just outside, propped up against the cabin wall. I didn't move it. No animal would have dragged it like that and not torn into it. I started thinking about heading out early. I had about 8 days left in the rental, but I started making plans. I wasn't scared exactly, just uneasy, like someone was watching the place. I hiked out to where the trail meets the clearing where my car was. I didn't see anyone. No other cars. But I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A pile of stones had been stacked next to the trail. Perfect little stack about knee-high, like a cairn but recent. Moss hadn't grown on them yet, and I didn't remember it being there when I came in. I picked one of the stones up. Underneath, I saw something dark. A scrap of fabric. Navy blue. I pulled it out and found it was a piece of synthetic jacket, like from a windbreaker. Torn. I didn't know what to make of it, but it put me on edge. That night I didn't cook, just ate a protein bar and stayed inside. Kept my light off, just sat by the window looking out into the woods. I thought I saw movement a few times, shadows between trees. Could have been animals, could have been nothing. I didn't sleep. At dawn, I packed everything. I made 2 fast trips to the car, heart pounding every time I left the cabin. I didn't hear or see anything, but the woods felt charged, like the air before a storm. When I got back to the car on my second trip, I found something that made my knees go weak. On the hood of my Subaru was a handprint, not a smudge, not dirt, a full, clear print made in ash, like someone with dirty hands had pressed their palm flat on the metal. It wasn't there an hour earlier. I loaded up the last of my stuff and drove out without looking back. I reported it to the county sheriff's office when I got back to town. They said they'd send someone to check it out. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. I never heard back. 2 weeks later, I got a text from the rental site. The listing for the cabin had been removed. No explanation, just gone. I still think about it sometimes. Not every day, but enough. Someone was out there, not some crazy killer or forest spirit. Just a person, watching, testing, waiting maybe, and I think if I'd stayed one more night, I might have found out why, or I wouldn't be telling this story at all. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a quick break from the stress of everyday life, a chance to get away from work, the city, and everything that felt like it was constantly on top of me. Just me, my backpack, and a cabin tucked away in the woods. The kind of place you'd find in the middle of nowhere. No Wi-Fi, no distractions, just nature and quiet. I had found the cabin online, buried deep in some obscure travel blog, and it seemed perfect. A rustic retreat in the woods, close enough to a town for supplies, but far enough to feel like I was completely disconnected from everything. The photos on the listing were nice. The cabin looked sturdy. The surroundings looked peaceful. Just what I needed. I drove up on a Friday evening. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the winding road. The air smelled different here, fresh, crisp, almost piney. The kind of clean air you can only get far from any major city. The road to the cabin was more of a dirt trail than anything, barely wide enough for my car to fit through. The last couple of miles had been rough. Potholes, branches hanging low, the road barely visible in the fading light. But when I finally turned onto the long gravel driveway leading to the cabin, I felt a sense of relief. The cabin itself was small, with a slanted roof and wooden siding that had clearly weathered many seasons. It wasn't much, just one room, a small kitchen, and a bathroom. The windows were large, offering views of the forest that stretched out in every direction. There was a porch with a couple of old rocking chairs and a woodpile stacked neatly beside the cabin. It looked like the kind of place someone might retreat to after a lifetime of hard work, a place to relax and unwind. Exactly what I was looking for. I unloaded my car, bringing in my bag, food, and a couple of books I had been meaning to read. The inside of the cabin was cozy, but old. There was a heavy wood stove in the corner, an old-fashioned refrigerator that made strange noises when it kicked on, and mismatched furniture. The floors creaked underfoot, and the wooden beams in the ceiling were exposed, giving the cabin an almost rustic charm. There were a couple of pictures on the walls, some of the landscapes surrounding the cabin, others of family members I didn't recognize. The place had a strange smell. Not bad, but earthy, like old wood and dust. At first, I thought it was just the oldness of the place. But as I moved around, I started to notice something else, something more subtle. It was like the air had a thickness to it, almost like the cabin was holding on to something. Maybe it was just my imagination. I'd been in cabins like this before, in similar places, and none of them had ever felt off. But there was something about this one that didn't sit right. I shrugged it off. I was tired from the drive, so I decided to relax, unpack a bit, and have some dinner. I started a fire in the wood stove, then pulled out a can of chili from my bag. The cabin's kitchen was simple, but it had everything I needed. A small stove, a microwave, and the basics: plates, cups, utensils. Nothing fancy, but that was fine. I wasn't here for luxury. As the fire crackled and the smell of the chili filled the cabin, I sat down at the small wooden table near the window. It was dark outside now, and I could only make out vague shapes of trees and the occasional movement of an animal or bird. The quiet was deafening. Not even the sound of cars or other people. Just silence. I wasn't used to this level of isolation. Back home, I lived in the city, surrounded by constant noise. It was a weird feeling to not hear anything, to not see any lights in the distance. It was just me, the cabin, and the woods. I finished my meal, cleaned up, and sat on the couch with a book. I tried to read for a while, but my eyes kept drifting to the window. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, or that there was something out there moving just beyond the trees. Every now and then, a branch would creak or the wind would rustle through the leaves, but nothing too unsettling. Still, the air felt dense, and the quiet was starting to make my skin crawl. Around 9:30 p.m., I decided to turn in for the night. The bed was simple, a queen-sized mattress with a heavy quilt on top. I left the light on for a while, listening to the sounds of the cabin settling. It felt old, as if it was alive in some way, groaning and shifting with the weight of time. I tried to ignore it, but it kept pulling my focus. The longer I lay there, the more I began to notice things. Small noises, the creak of the floorboards, the rattle of the windows as the wind picked up. I eventually managed to drift off to sleep, but it wasn't the peaceful sleep I'd been hoping for. I woke up a few times during the night, feeling like I was being watched. There was a weight to the stillness around me, a pressure that didn't feel natural. I told myself it was just nerves, nothing more. The next morning, I woke up early to the sound of birds chirping outside. The sun had barely risen, but the light creeping through the curtains was soft and warm. I got up and stretched, still feeling a little unsettled but determined to shake off the odd feelings from the night before. I made myself a cup of coffee, sat down on the porch, and watched the sun climb higher into the sky. The day was clear, the air fresh and cool. For a while, it was easy to believe that this place was just what I needed. But as the day wore on, something started to change. Little things, mostly. I noticed that the wind had picked up, whipping through the trees in gusts. The kind of wind that made the branches groan and creak, but it wasn't particularly unusual for a wooded area. What was strange was that it seemed to be coming from all directions at once. Normally, wind has a direction. It comes from the north or the south or wherever. But this wind, it didn't seem to have any clear origin. It felt unnatural. I went for a walk around the property, thinking maybe it would help clear my head. The cabin was surrounded by a thick forest, with only a narrow dirt path leading off into the trees. I followed it for a while, trying to get a sense of the land. The woods were dense, the trees tall and imposing, but there was something about the forest that felt wrong. Not dangerous exactly, but unsettling. The way the trees grew too close together, their trunks twisted and gnarled. The way the shadows seemed to stretch and twist even when there was no reason for them to do so. I kept walking until I came across a small clearing, just a few hundred feet away from the cabin. The ground was covered in moss, and there was a rock outcrop at one end, offering a nice view of the woods beyond. I sat down on one of the rocks, trying to calm my mind, but it wasn't long before I noticed something strange. A line of tracks running through the center of the clearing. They were fresh, the dirt still disturbed, but they didn't look like any animal tracks I was familiar with. They were too large, too deep, and they weren't spaced out evenly like the tracks of an animal. They were irregular, almost like someone had walked through the clearing, dragging their feet. I stood up, suddenly feeling more uneasy than I had since I arrived. I glanced around, but there was no sign of anyone, no sign of anything that could have left those tracks. I turned back toward the cabin, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. By the time I made it back to the cabin, the wind had picked up again, stronger than before. It howled through the trees, making the cabin groan. I went inside and locked the door behind me, not because I thought I was in immediate danger, but because the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I tried to shake it off and went about my day, but something about the place kept gnawing at me. That evening, I decided to turn in early. I didn't want to think about the strange tracks, the unsettling wind, or the feeling of being watched. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, the noise outside seemed louder. The wind wasn't just howling now, it was slamming into the cabin, rattling the windows like someone was trying to break in. The sound was relentless, like the storm was trying to get in, trying to drag me out into the woods. I lay in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the storm rage outside. Then it stopped, just like that. Silence. I felt like the entire world had gone still. Even the wind. The eerie, unnatural quiet that followed was worse than the storm itself. I couldn't handle it. My mind was racing, and I needed to know what was going on. I got out of bed and grabbed a flashlight. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but something told me I couldn't just ignore it anymore. The cabin was completely still, the kind of stillness that was almost suffocating. I opened the door to the porch and stepped outside, shining the flashlight around the area. There was nothing. No animals, no signs of anything. But as I moved the light toward the edge of the property, I saw something. A shadow, moving in the trees, slowly, like it was watching me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It didn't move like any animal I knew. It was too deliberate, too human. It was just a figure, standing there, barely visible in the shadows. I couldn't take my eyes off it. My stomach churned, and my whole... My name is Marcus Reed. I'm 37 now, but this happened 10 years ago, back in 2015. I was living in Portland at the time, working as a freelance photojournalist. I'd been going nonstop for months. Between assignments, editing, and chasing invoices, I was burnt out. I needed a break, something that would put me off-grid for a while. Not a beach or some fancy hotel, but real solitude. Somewhere quiet, somewhere I could reset. That's when I found the listing. It was on a tiny vacation rental site, not one of the big ones. A small, plain-looking cabin up in northeastern Washington, near Colville. The photos didn't show much. One exterior shot, a few trees around it, a wood stove inside. No hot tub, no Wi-Fi, no cell service. It was perfect. It was cheap too, almost suspiciously cheap. But I figured it was because it was so isolated. The owner only messaged me once, just to confirm the dates. No long contracts or lists of rules. Just a message. Cabins stocked with wood and water. No reception. Nearest towns 40 minutes south. Bring what you need. I packed enough groceries for 2 weeks, loaded my old Subaru with gear, and made the 7-hour drive from Portland to Colville. From there, it was another 40 minutes along a badly maintained forest road. It was late September, right before the cold really starts to settle in. The leaves had turned, the air was dry, and the sky was a dull gray. The cabin sat in a clearing maybe 2 acres wide, surrounded by thick pine and fir trees. No neighboring houses, no power lines, just trees and sky and that old wooden structure. It was small, maybe 25 by 25 feet, with dark, weathered siding and a rusty tin roof. There was a little porch with a single step, and beside the cabin, maybe 30 yards back, was a shed. That shed would become important, but I didn't know that yet. The inside was simple. One big room with a wood stove in the center, a small kitchenette, a table with 2 chairs, and a twin bed in the corner. No electricity, no plumbing. There was a rain barrel behind the cabin and a pit toilet about 15 yards into the woods. It wasn't luxury, but it was what I wanted. The first few days were peaceful. I spent them reading, chopping wood, walking through the forest. I took a few photos for myself, nothing professional. Just the trees, the changing leaves, the cabin in the morning light. I'd never felt so disconnected from the world, and I mean that in the best way. It was on the 4th night that I noticed something strange. It was late, around 11 p.m., and I'd been asleep for a couple of hours when I woke up. No noise, no nightmare, just that feeling, that something isn't quite right. I sat up in bed, and the first thing I noticed was the stove. It had gone out. That wasn't too weird. Sometimes the wood burns faster than you expect. But then I heard it, a sound from outside, not close, far back, maybe at the edge of the clearing. It was subtle, like a soft scraping or dragging noise. Came in short bursts, like something being pulled along the ground. I held my breath and listened. It went quiet. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or a raccoon maybe. I had seen both near the cabin. Still, I got up and lit a candle. I didn't go outside, though. I stood by the window and looked out, but the glass was old and wavy, and the moon wasn't out. Couldn't see a thing. I stayed up another hour, staring out the window, but nothing else happened. The next morning, I went out to look around. I checked the clearing and the edge of the woods. I didn't see anything at first, but when I walked toward the shed, I noticed something strange in the grass. A line, a narrow track like something heavy had been dragged. It started a few feet from the shed and led into the trees. I followed it maybe 20 feet before it disappeared. The ground there was firmer, less grass, but the track definitely started near the shed. I hadn't gone into the shed yet. I figured it was just for tools or firewood, but now I was curious. The door had a latch, not locked, just hooked. I opened it slowly. The smell hit me first. Dust, old wood, and something faintly sour. Inside was dark, but enough light came in through a small window to see. There wasn't much in there. A broken wheelbarrow, some rusted tools, an old tarp, and a large plastic barrel. That's what caught my eye. It was white with a blue lid, like the kind used for chemicals or rainwater. It was stained on the outside, like something had leaked from it at one point. I walked over and knocked on it. Solid. I tried to lift the lid, but it was sealed tight, duct taped around the edge. I didn't want to mess with it too much. Could have been anything, waste oil, pesticide, whatever. Still, it gave me a weird feeling. I left the shed and didn't go back in. That night, I brought the hatchet inside the cabin. I wasn't scared exactly, but I was uneasy. That dragging noise hadn't been nothing. And the shed, it just didn't sit right with me. Around midnight, I woke up again. This time, I knew what had woken me. There was a noise right outside the cabin. Not at the edge of the clearing. Not in the woods. Right outside. I held my breath and listened. Slow footsteps. On the porch. 1, 2. Then the creak of the wooden step. My heart was pounding. The cabin door was latched, but it was old. No deadbolt. Just a hook latch and a piece of wood jammed under the handle. The footsteps stopped. I waited. Minutes passed. I didn't dare move. Then finally I heard the creak again. The step. Then footsteps moving away this time. Soft, deliberate. Toward the back of the cabin. Toward the shed. I sat in that bed until dawn. When the sun came up, I went outside. There were marks in the dirt on the step. Indents. Not clear footprints, just enough to know someone had been there. I walked to the back of the cabin. The shed door was open. I know I'd latched it. Inside, the barrel was gone. Not moved. Gone. I stood there, trying to understand what I was seeing. The barrel was heavy. I tried lifting it. No way it had been taken by an animal. And even if it had leaked out, there would have been a stain. But the spot where it sat was clean. That day, I packed up. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire going and stayed up with my back to the wall, holding the hatchet. Every sound outside made my skin crawl. I heard the dragging again, closer this time. But I didn't go to the window. I didn't move. When the sun rose, I left everything but the essentials and drove back to Colville. I stopped at the sheriff's office and told them what had happened. I showed them the photos I'd taken of the shed, the drag marks, everything. They didn't say much, just took my statement and told me they'd check it out. I never heard back. A few months later, I got curious and searched the address online. The listing was gone. Nothing about it anywhere. Not on the site, not on Google. It was like it never existed. Years passed. I tried to forget about it. Told myself maybe I'd imagined parts of it. Stress, isolation, sleep deprivation. That kind of thing messes with your head. But then, just last year, I got a package. No return address. Inside was a small stack of photos. Old Polaroids, yellowed and faded. All taken in that clearing. The cabin, the shed. But not from the outside. From inside. And in one of them, you could see me, sleeping, in the bed. It was late October, 2021, when I drove out to the northern woods of Maine, just past a place called Tunk Lake. I had taken 2 weeks off from work. I was 33 then, living alone in Portland, working remotely in tech. I'd gotten tired of the noise, the traffic, the same apartment walls. I needed something quieter, slower. I found an old off-grid cabin listed on a site for remote rentals. It was supposed to be peaceful, no cell signal, just a radio and solar panels for lights. It was owned by some old guy who didn't live there anymore. Said he only used it in summers now. The listing showed a small wooden cabin sitting at the edge of a dense forest with a steep ridge in the background. It looked like exactly what I needed. The road up there was rough. I drove a 15-year-old Subaru that rattled every time I hit a pothole, and the last 3 miles were nothing but dirt and loose stone. The air got colder the farther I went. Leaves had already turned, mostly orange and deep red, and the trees looked ready to drop them any day. The cabin was about 20 minutes from the nearest paved road and surrounded by thick trees. There were no neighbors, no signs of other people. Just trees, birds, and the faint sound of wind on the ridge behind the place. It wasn't big. One main room with a wood stove, a tiny kitchen setup, a cot in the corner, and a deck that looked out toward the woods. There was a small outhouse behind the cabin, maybe 20 yards away. Water came from a hand pump outside. No fridge, just a big cooler. I brought enough food to last the 2 weeks, dried stuff, canned stuff, and a big container of water in case the pump didn't work. The first few days were exactly what I'd hoped for. I'd wake up to the sound of wind in the trees, spend the day walking the woods or reading, chop some firewood, cook basic meals. I didn't hear a single car, didn't see a single plane. It was pure silence except for the birds and the trees. At night, it got quiet in a way that made you feel like the world had been turned off. I noticed the ridge behind the cabin on the first day, just a steep rise covered in trees and large boulders. I didn't climb it at first. It was rocky and steep, and the undergrowth was thick. I figured I'd explore it later, maybe on the weekend. But on the 4th day, I was out collecting fallen branches for the fire when I thought I saw something near the base of the ridge. Just a quick movement. It was far away, maybe 100 feet up the slope, partly hidden behind some trees. Could have been a deer or a bird. I didn't think much of it. There were tons of animals around, and the woods were full of movement. But that night, when I was sitting by the fire outside the cabin, I kept glancing up toward the ridge. It was pitch black up there. The trees swayed slowly in the wind, and the shadows looked like they were shifting in small ways. I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was being jumpy, city brain not used to pure darkness. I went inside, shut the door, and locked it. I didn't sleep great. I kept waking up to small noises, twigs cracking, something brushing against the cabin wall. I told myself it was wind. The next morning, I decided to climb the ridge. I needed to shake off the paranoia. The slope behind the cabin wasn't too far, maybe a quarter-mile walk, but the incline was steep. I took a thermos of water, wore gloves and boots, and started up around 10 in the morning. It was colder in the shade. The ridge was rockier than I'd thought. Big slabs of granite jutted out at odd angles, and the trees thinned the higher I went. Halfway up, I stopped to catch my breath and looked back toward the cabin. It looked smaller from up there, just a tiny brown square tucked between trees. When I reached the top, I expected a view. I thought maybe I'd see the lake or even the road, but it was just more trees, more rocks. The forest stretched in every direction. But then I noticed something strange about the ground. Just off the ridge, there was a narrow dirt path, like something had been walking the same line over and over. It didn't look like an animal trail. It was too clean, too even. And nearby, tucked under a small overhang of rock, I found what looked like an old hunting blind. It was rough, just a few pieces of plywood leaned against rocks. But inside, there were a couple of beer cans and a rusted folding chair. It looked old, but not ancient. Maybe a few years. Someone had spent time there. I didn't stay long. I got an odd feeling standing there, like I was being watched. I hiked back down, took the long way around, and returned to the cabin by early afternoon. For the rest of the day, I kept thinking about the blind. Something about it felt wrong. Who had built it? Why right there, where it overlooked my cabin but nothing else? That night, I made sure to close the curtains before lighting the lanterns. I felt exposed even inside. I didn't sit outside after dark. I didn't want to look up at the ridge again. I kept thinking about how easy it would be for someone to watch me from up there, hidden behind those rocks and trees. I fell asleep with a hatchet next to the cot. The next morning, I found something that made me feel sick. There were footprints in the soft dirt near the fire pit. Human footprints, barefoot. It had rained slightly overnight, just enough to leave the soil damp, and the prints were fresh. They came from the woods, circled the fire pit, and led off toward the ridge. My boots were still where I'd left them, and I hadn't walked barefoot outside at all. I stood there staring at them for a long time. My first thought was maybe a hiker had gotten lost, but no one was out here. I hadn't seen a car in days, no tire tracks on the road in, and who walks barefoot through the woods? I felt a tightening in my chest. I checked my supplies. Everything seemed untouched. I looked around the edge of the cabin. Nothing. No signs of a person. I considered packing up and leaving, but I'd paid for 2 weeks, and I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was an old footprint, and the rain had just brought it out again. I spent that day chopping more firewood and tried to keep busy, but I couldn't relax. I kept checking the tree line, kept listening for movement. That night, I didn't sleep. The following day, I found more prints. This time, they were near the outhouse. Same shape, bare feet, narrow heels, deep impressions. I followed them a short distance, but they vanished into the brush. Whoever it was, they knew how to move through the woods. I decided then I'd leave the next morning. I started packing some gear. I didn't want to be there another night, but I also didn't want to drive the dirt road in the dark. I stayed inside all evening, lantern off. I sat on the cot with my hatchet and waited. I kept listening. Sometime after midnight, I heard something outside. It was faint, just a light crunch of leaves. Then silence. Then another, closer, like someone walking slowly. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just sat there watching the door. The steps stopped. For maybe a full minute, there was nothing. Then I heard a faint tap. Just one, like a fingertip on the wooden wall. I didn't move. I waited. Then another, this time closer to the window. Then silence again. I stayed like that until the sun came up. When it was light, I stepped outside. Nothing was there, but I found something under the window, a small bundle of pine needles tied with string. It looked like it had been placed there deliberately. I don't know why, but it felt like a message. I grabbed my things, loaded the car, and left. I didn't clean up. I didn't leave a note. I just drove. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. And even then, I kept looking in the rearview mirror. I drove straight home to Portland. That was the end of it, I thought. But 2 weeks later, I got a letter. No return address. Just my name, no stamp. It had been hand-delivered. Inside was a photo, an old Polaroid. It was a picture of the cabin, but it had been taken from above, from the ridge. And in the picture, I was standing on the deck, staring off into the trees. I never told anyone. I burned the photo. I moved to a new apartment. I don't go into the woods anymore. I still don't know who was up there or why they watched me, but they'd been watching the whole time, and I didn't see them until it was too late. I was 34 when I decided to leave everything behind for a while. I had spent the past 8 years working in advertising in New York City, staring at glowing screens, pitching nonsense to companies I didn't care about. After a particularly brutal month of 14-hour days and sleepless nights, I finally broke. I took unpaid leave and left the city. My plan was simple: disappear for a month and write the book I'd been talking about for years. I found a cabin on a small rental site. It wasn't on Airbnb or any fancy platform, just an old listing with a couple blurry photos and a vague description. Quiet retreat in the Vermont woods. No internet, no cell service, solar power, well water, with stove, 7 miles from town. That was all it said. It was perfect. I packed my car with groceries, my laptop, notebooks, and clothes. I even brought some basic tools and my old hunting knife my grandfather gave me when I was a kid. The cabin was near a small town called Weston, Vermont. I'd never heard of it, but that didn't matter. I wanted to be away from everything. The last few miles of the drive were on a dirt road so narrow that branches scraped against my car on both sides. I kept thinking I'd missed a turn, but eventually the trees opened up just enough to reveal a small clearing. And there it was, the cabin. It was smaller than I'd expected. One main room with a bed, a small table, and a wood stove. There was a little kitchenette with a gas-powered stove and a small fridge that ran on solar. The bathroom was more like an outhouse attached to the side, but at least it had a composting toilet and a gravity-fed shower. The water came from a tank I had to fill manually from a pump near the woodshed. I was excited. I was finally away from everything. The silence was overwhelming the first night. No sirens, no cars, not even planes overhead. Just the wind through the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. The first few days went exactly as I'd hoped. I woke up early, made coffee on the stove, and wrote until it got dark. I cooked simple meals, read in the evenings by lantern, and went to bed early. There was no signal for my phone, no internet to distract me. I was finally doing what I said I'd do for years, but around the 5th night, something changed. I was sitting at the little table, writing by lantern light, when I heard something outside. It was faint at first, just a rustle. I assumed it was an animal. There were squirrels all over, and I'd seen a couple deer near the edge of the clearing that morning. But then it happened again, closer this time. A definite, deliberate sound, like a footstep. I froze. I turned off the lantern and waited, listening. My ears adjusted to the silence. I couldn't hear anything for a minute. Then another step, and another. Something was walking around the cabin. I stood quietly and moved toward the window. I couldn't see anything at first. The moon was behind the clouds, and the forest was almost pitch black. But then, near the tree line, I saw a shape, a human shape. Someone was standing there, not moving, just watching. I blinked, looked again. The shape was gone. I stayed up the rest of the night with the lights off. I held my knife and kept glancing out the window every 10 minutes. But I didn't see anything else. In the morning, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or maybe I was just jumpy. I hadn't spoken to another person in almost a week, and maybe that was messing with my head. I went outside and walked the perimeter of the cabin. I found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing unusual. But that night, it happened again. This time, it started with a scraping sound, like something dragging across the wall of the cabin. I turned off the lantern and waited. It was just past 10 p.m. I hadn't gone to bed yet. The scraping stopped, and I heard the crunch of leaves. Slow, deliberate steps. They circled the cabin. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stood there in the dark, holding the knife. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. In the morning, I went outside again and checked the walls. There were faint scratches on the wood, about waist high. Nothing deep, nothing clear, but they hadn't been there before. I started locking the cabin more carefully after that. I kept the knife with me at all times, even inside, and I started sleeping with one ear open, waking at every sound. I thought about leaving, but I was 7 miles from the nearest town, and the road was rough. My car was fine, but I didn't want to run at the first weird noise. I wanted to believe I could stick it out, that this was just paranoia. A few more nights passed without anything. I thought maybe whoever or whatever it was had moved on. But then, I woke up one night to the sound of the door handle turning. I hadn't imagined it. I heard the metal click. Then again, someone was trying to open the door, slowly, like they didn't want to make noise. I sat up and grabbed my knife. The door was locked, but it wasn't a strong lock, just a single bolt. I waited. The handle stopped moving. Then came the footsteps, slow around the cabin again. Same pattern. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I packed a small bag and walked toward town. I figured I'd call the property owner, maybe get a police check. But a mile down the trail, my phone still had no signal, and the path was covered in fallen branches. It would take hours to get to town on foot, so I went back. I told myself I'd give it one more night. I slept during the day so I could stay awake all night. I turned off all the lights and sat in the corner with a blanket wrapped around me, watching the windows. It was around 1 a.m. when I saw the shape again. This time, it wasn't at the tree line. It was right outside the window, just a silhouette. A man, definitely, standing perfectly still, not doing anything, just watching. I didn't move. I didn't blink. After maybe 5 minutes, he stepped backward and vanished into the dark. That was the last straw. At first light, I packed everything into the car and drove straight to town. It was a tiny place. Weston barely had a gas station. I found the police station, which was really just a small building with a single cruiser out front. I told the officer everything. He listened, nodded, and made a call. Another officer drove back with me to the cabin. We walked the perimeter again. Nothing obvious. No footprints, no signs of a break-in. Then he found something. Behind the cabin, near the woodshed, there was a narrow path I hadn't noticed. It led deeper into the trees. About 50 yards in, we found a small clearing. There were wrappers on the ground, a couple beer cans, and what looked like an old tarp. Someone had been camping there, watching. The officer radioed it in. He said it might have been a squatter, maybe someone living off-grid, or maybe just someone messing with me. Either way, he said I made the right call. I didn't stay. I left that day and never went back. A few weeks later, I got a call. They'd found more signs in the woods, makeshift traps, old food cans, even a journal with strange notes in it. Nothing criminal, just odd. No name, no ID. Whoever it was had vanished. I didn't finish the book. I haven't gone back to the woods since. But sometimes, when I lie in bed at night, I think about that shape standing in the dark, just watching. I think about how quiet the forest was, how easy it would have been for someone to live out there, unnoticed, and how lucky I was to leave when I did. I'm not really the kind of person who writes stuff down, but this one has been sitting in my head for over a year now. I figured it's either write it or keep waking up with my teeth clenched so tight I can barely chew in the morning. This happened in the fall of 2021 in northern Idaho, just south of Sandpoint. I was 34 then, living in Spokane. I'd just gotten out of a rough relationship and had taken time off work, some unpaid leave, to get my head straight. A friend of mine mentioned an old family cabin his uncle had stopped using years ago. It was deep in the forest, not fancy, but stocked with the basics. No rent, just needed someone to make sure no trees had crashed into the place or animals hadn't torn through it. It sounded perfect. I had a beat-up green Subaru Outback and I loaded it with the usuals: canned food, a couple coolers, propane, flashlight, battery-powered radio, matches, some paperback books, a folding knife, and enough clothes for a week. I planned to stay 5 days, maybe 6. It was October 10th when I left. The air was already getting sharp, and up north the trees had turned full gold and rust red. It was a long drive, and by the time I turned off the highway onto the smaller roads, I'd only seen a handful of cars all day. The road to the cabin was more like a trail. Gravel, uneven, with branches scraping the car on both sides. I hadn't seen a cell signal since over an hour back. There were no signs, no fences, just thick woods. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked like something from a postcard until you got closer. It was a one-story wooden thing, maybe 800 square feet. It sat in a small clearing, roof dark with moss. One window was cracked, and the boards looked warped from years of weather. The front steps creaked, and the door stuck, but it opened. Inside was cold, smelled faintly of mildew and dust, but otherwise okay. One bedroom, one small bathroom with no running water, a living space with a couch and a cast iron stove, and a tiny kitchen with an old Coleman cooler on the counter. There were mouse droppings in the corners, and I found a couple dead flies on the windowsills, but no serious damage. The place had no electricity. There was a generator, but I never got it started. I didn't mind. I was here for quiet, and I had batteries, a headlamp, and a lantern. I swept the floor, unpacked my stuff, and started a small fire in the stove. The first night, I sat outside in a fold-out chair with a blanket around my shoulders and just listened. Wind, rustling leaves, the occasional snap of a branch in the woods. I slept okay. The bed was stiff, but I was tired enough not to care. The second day, I chopped some firewood, walked a mile down the trail, and saw no one. It started drizzling that afternoon and kept going into the evening. I stayed in and read, made some soup, and bundled up in a hoodie and thick socks. It was colder now. That night, I heard something thump against the side of the cabin. I figured it was a branch or something small falling from the trees. The third day is when things started to feel off. I went out early, around 7 a.m., with the idea of walking farther down the path. I took a thermos of coffee and my knife in case I ran into anything. After about 2 miles, I noticed something weird. The path had boot prints on it. Not fresh, but not old either. The rain had softened the dirt, and these prints hadn't been rained on. They were heading the same direction I was. That stopped me cold. I knew this cabin wasn't used anymore. My friend said his uncle hadn't been up there in 4 years. I hadn't seen a single person or car since I arrived. There were no campsites nearby and no other cabins. This trail didn't go anywhere. It just looped around to an old hunting spot his uncle used to visit. I followed the prints for a bit. They were wide-set, like from someone tall, and deep enough to show weight. Then they turned off the path into the woods. I didn't follow them. I turned around and walked slowly back to the cabin. I kept checking behind me. I didn't feel watched exactly, but my nerves were up. Back at the cabin, I locked the door for the first time. I ate a little but had no appetite. Around sunset, I stepped outside to grab more firewood and noticed something even weirder. There were drag marks in the dirt by the side of the cabin. Long, wide scuffs like something had been pulled across the ground. I crouched and touched the dirt. It was still damp, and the grooves were fresh. My first thought was animal, maybe a deer got caught in something and dragged it. But the width was wrong, and there were boot prints beside it. Same kind as before. I stood up and looked around. The trees were just standing there. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been right there just hours ago. Watching the cabin, doing something, dragging something. That night, I barely slept. I kept the fire going and sat with my knife beside me. At one point, I turned off my lantern and just sat in the dark, listening. Around 2 a.m., I heard soft crunching in the leaves outside. Not near the front door, but around back near the bathroom wall. Then a bump. Then silence. I didn't move. Didn't even breathe. Eventually, the sounds stopped. I must have fallen asleep for an hour or two because the next thing I remember, it was light out. I opened the door and stepped outside. The first thing I saw was a small pile of ash beside the cabin, near the bathroom window. It hadn't been there before. Something had been burned. I poked through it with a stick. There were scraps of fabric, metal bits, something plastic and melted. I couldn't tell what it had been, but it wasn't from the cabin. I hadn't burned anything outside. That was the tipping point. I decided I'd leave the next day. I packed most of my stuff and put it by the door. I didn't want to risk driving out at night. The road was rough, and if I broke an axle or slid off the trail, I'd be stuck without help. I spent the day checking the windows, looking for anything out of place. The woods felt still. No birds, even. No movement. That evening, as the sun dropped below the trees, I looked out through the living room window. Far off, maybe 100 yards back into the woods, I saw something. Tarp. It was green, partially buried under leaves and brush. It looked old, maybe caught on something, but it hadn't been there before. Not in that spot. I would have seen it. I took my binoculars and looked through them. It wasn't just a tarp. It was covering something. I couldn't see exactly what. Just a shape, long and uneven, like a mound. I stared at it for a long time. Then I put the binoculars down, closed the window shutters, and built up the fire. I kept the axe close. I didn't go outside. I tried to sleep, but the wind picked up. Every creak of the trees made my heart jump. I kept seeing that shape in my head. I knew what it looked like, even if I didn't want to admit it, like a body. Next morning, I was out of that cabin by 6:30, threw everything in the car and didn't even eat. The car started on the first try, thank God. I drove slow at first, eyes darting through the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the trail was empty. I hit the main road after an hour, got a signal back near the highway and called my friend. I didn't tell him everything, just said I found signs of people and that I didn't feel safe. He said he'd send someone to check it out. I never heard what they found. I never asked. I didn't want to know if the drag marks led to the tarp, or what was under it. I didn't want to know who'd been walking around out there, or why they'd burned something by the cabin. I had 100 guesses, but not one of them made me feel better. I know it wasn't a ghost story, nothing supernatural, just a cold, real reminder that out there in the woods, far from anyone, the worst thing you can run into isn't a monster. It's another person. And whatever they were doing out there, I wasn't supposed to see it. I'm back in Spokane now. I moved to a place with streetlights and neighbors and locks that actually work. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night and think I hear something dragging across the floor. But there's nothing there. Not anymore. My name's Ryan Carter. I'm 33 years old, and this happened to me in the fall of 2022. Just outside of Whitefield, New Hampshire, near the edge of the White Mountains. I was born and raised in Maine, but I'd been living in New York for years. Life in the city had worn me down. Work, traffic, noise, people, always people. I needed to get away from it all for a bit. That's what I told myself when I booked a week-long stay in a remote cabin I found online. It wasn't through a big travel site. I saw it listed on an obscure forum where outdoorsy people shared off-the-grid rental spots. The ad said cabin past Wolf Ridge. No neighbors, no noise, just nature. That was enough for me. I emailed the guy, wired him half the rental fee up front, and he sent me back an old-looking PDF map with a red X drawn on it, along with a few written directions. He told me cell signal wouldn't reach that far, but that there was an emergency satellite phone in the cabin if I needed it. I packed light, just a backpack, some basic food, and my camera gear. I do photography on the side and figured this trip could also be a creative reset. I drove from the city, passed through a few towns, and turned off onto a logging road that looked barely used. From there, I followed a winding dirt trail that climbed up through the trees for about an hour. Eventually, the road ended at a metal gate. I parked, hopped it, and hiked the last mile to the cabin. It was early October, and the air had that crisp bite to it. Red and gold leaves covered the forest floor. The cabin itself sat in a small clearing, tucked between some dense pines and a granite slope. It was older than I expected, probably built in the 60s. It had that musty wood smell, the kind that hits you the second you open the door. One bedroom, one main room with a wood stove, a tiny kitchen area, and a bathroom with a composting toilet. No running water, but there were jugs stacked against the wall and a barrel outside to collect rain. There was no electricity, just a lantern and some candles. I didn't mind. That first night, I made some canned soup, lit a few candles, and sat on the front porch with a blanket over my legs. The silence was deep, almost too deep. No engines, no sirens, no buzz of neon signs or chatter. Just wind in the trees and the occasional crack of a branch. I felt better than I had in months. The next morning, I got up around sunrise, made coffee on a little camp stove, and hiked up the ridge behind the cabin. There was a great view from the top, miles of forest stretching out in every direction. I took some photos, sat for a while, and then headed back down. That afternoon, I explored around the area. Found some animal tracks, probably deer, maybe moose. The forest felt untouched, peaceful. I cooked a bit more, read from a book I brought, and went to sleep early. That second night, I heard something outside. A soft thump, then a dragging sound. I sat up, heart beating fast, but reminded myself it was probably a raccoon or a porcupine. Still, I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I went outside and saw the lid to the rain barrel had been knocked off. A few jugs of water were lying on their sides, but none were broken. There were no deep prints in the dirt, just scattered leaves and a few scuffed patches near the edge of the woods. It didn't seem like a bear or anything heavy had come through. Later that day, I checked out the satellite phone, just to be sure it worked. It was old and clunky, the kind you had to extend the antenna on, but it powered up. I didn't make a call. I didn't want to use up battery for no reason. That evening, I was chopping wood near the shed when I noticed something strange. Some of the stacked logs looked moved, like they weren't in the same place as before. I thought maybe I was just being paranoid. I went inside, locked the door, and tried to let it go, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been nearby, watching, maybe even inside at some point. That night, it got worse. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a soft scratching sound. It was faint but definitely real. Not the wind. It was rhythmic, like something scraping slowly at the outside wall. I held my breath, waiting. Then it stopped. I stayed frozen in bed for almost an hour, listening. At some point, I must have fallen asleep again. But when I woke up, there was a line carved into the wood outside, just below the bedroom window. A thin, deliberate line about 3 feet long, maybe made with a knife or nail. I felt a knot form in my stomach. I decided to hike back to my car and check in somewhere else. But when I got to the gate where I parked, my car was gone. At first, I thought I'd walked to the wrong spot. I ran up and down the trail for 10 minutes, thinking maybe I passed another gate without realizing. But no, it was the same spot. I remembered the broken signpost nearby and the mossy rock with a white streak on it. This was the place, and my car was gone. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes in complete silence. My thoughts were scrambled. I didn't know if I'd been robbed or if this was some sort of prank. I looked around, but the forest just stared back at me, still and empty. I hiked back to the cabin and sat on the porch for hours, waiting, hoping someone would come. A ranger, a hunter, anybody. But no one did. I used the satellite phone. I called the number labeled emergency services. The call rang and rang, then dropped. I tried again. Same thing. The battery meter blinked red. I tried one last time before it died completely. Nothing. I was on my own. That night, I barely slept. I kept the lantern on until it burned out. I kept a knife from the kitchen under my pillow. At some point in the early morning, I heard footsteps. Not animal steps, real, heavy footsteps moving slowly around the porch. I lay completely still, holding my breath, barely blinking. Then came a single knock. Not on the door, on the wall. Just a slow, soft tap. And then nothing. I waited until daylight to get up. I opened the door with the knife in hand, stepped out, and looked around. No one, no prints, nothing had been touched. But in the dirt right in front of the porch steps was a small pile of rocks, stacked carefully, 6 of them, one on top of the other. I don't know why, but that disturbed me more than anything else. Felt like a message, like whoever was out there wanted me to know they could come and go as they pleased. I considered hiking the full trail back to the main road, but it was over 20 miles. I didn't know the way without the car's GPS. The paper map only showed the immediate area. By day 5, I was barely holding it together. I hadn't seen anyone, hadn't eaten much, and was starting to feel feverish. I spent most of the day sitting inside with the knife in my lap. Every time I heard a noise, I jumped. Then, just before sunset, I saw something. A man, at the edge of the trees. He was wearing a hooded jacket and standing completely still, half hidden in shadow. I stared at him for what felt like minutes, then blinked, and he was gone. Not walked away, just gone. I ran outside, screaming, but there was nothing, just leaves rustling in the breeze. I didn't go back in. I grabbed my pack, filled 2 jugs with water, and started walking. I didn't care how far it was. I just wanted out. I hiked until it was pitch dark, then kept going by flashlight. Around midnight, I stumbled onto a logging road, different than the one I'd driven in on. I followed it until sunrise, then finally saw a small hunting shack. It was unlocked, abandoned, and had a CB radio. The radio worked. I called for help over and over until someone answered. Took hours for a ranger to get to me. I was dehydrated, filthy, and nearly delirious. They took me to a small station, gave me water and food, and then took my statement. I told them everything. They sent someone to check the cabin, but they didn't find anything unusual. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing. They did eventually find my car, parked neatly behind an old barn 15 miles south. No damage, no signs of a break-in, like someone had just driven it there and walked away. The rental owner I'd booked with, they couldn't track him down. The email account was deleted. The bank wire went to an untraceable account. The cabin itself wasn't listed in any local records. It's like it wasn't even supposed to be there. To this day, I don't know who was out there with me. I don't know why they chose me or what they wanted. But I do know this, whoever they weren't just passing through. They were patient, they were quiet, and they were watching from the moment I arrived. I haven't gone camping since. I live in Vermont now, in a small town with neighbors on both sides and streetlights that stay on all night. I keep the doors locked, I keep the curtains closed, and I never, ever go into the woods alone.